Hello, friends. Shagnik sir here, the madman from the VARC sessions. Welcome. This is a session on the previous year's questions from the actual CAT. These are actual CAT questions that have featured in the real CAT. Now, it is vital to solve these papers, the previous year's papers of the CAT, not randomly, but with a specific purpose in mind. Because not only do these give you a lot of information about the actual CAT papers, about the IIMs who make these papers, what is the question type? What is the thought process behind these questions? What is the difficulty standards? What are the difficulty standards of these questions? Not only that information, but also these papers can be a very good indicator of where you stand in terms of your preparation. If you take these papers at the very beginning of your preparation, what would your score be? If you take them a few months into your preparation, what then would your score be? And if you take these papers just before taking the actual CAT for your current year, what would your scores be like? It is a very good indicator of what you would score in your actual CAT, adjusting for the minor differences in difficulty and format, etc. So we will be doing actual CAT questions, RC and VA questions. These would be from the recent year's papers, so from 22 to 24. That's 3 years, questions selected according to difficulty. We will deal with the RCs first because traditionally that's how the CATs have set the papers till 2023. It was always RC at the beginning of the section and VA after that. The first four passages, the first 16 questions would be RC questions across 4 passages, and they would then be followed by VA questions from question 17 to 24. So we will do it in this order itself. This order was changed in CAT 2024. IMC interspersed the section. They put in VA questions, then RC questions, then VA questions, then RC questions, and so on. Let us see what IMK does with the CAT paper this year, CAT 2025. In the meantime, we will discuss the RCs first, and then we'll go on to the VA questions. Let's begin. So here is the first passage that we would like to discuss. This passage is from economics. It talks about the influences of economics towards economics and outside. Please feel free to pause the video at any point of time to check out the entire passage. This is the first paragraph, the second paragraph, the third and fourth paragraphs, the fifth paragraph, and the end of the passage. 5 paragraphs to this passage. We see that this is from CAT 2024, the first shift, the morning shift. We realize from the passage that it is talking about what factors influence economy or economics, the study of economics. Oftentimes when economists cross borders, we're not talking about crossing borders literally, we're talking about them crossing borders of their subjects. They're less interested in learning from others than in invading their garden plots. Gary Becker, for instance, pioneered the idea of human capital. To do so, he famously tackled topics like crime, domesticity, applying methods honed in the study of markets to domains of non-market. This is where we see cross borders. So study of markets or economic aspects, study of economic aspects, applied them to domains of non-market life, non-economic aspects, one could say. Projected economics outward into new realms, for example, by revealing the extent to which humans calculate marginal utilities when choosing their spouses or stealing from their neighbors. At the same time, he did not let other ways of thinking enter his own economic realm. For example, he did not borrow from anthropology, history, let observations of non-market economics inform his Homo economicus. Becker was a picture of the imperial economist in the heyday of the discipline's bravura. The imperial economist is the imperial outlook of economy. The second paragraph mentions how in the present, this situation has changed. Times have changed for the once almighty discipline. Economics have been taken to task within and beyond its ramparts. Some economists have reached out, imparted, borrowed, collaborated, been less imperial, more open. Consider Thomas Piketty and his outreach to historians. The booming fields of behavioral economics, the fusion of economics and social psychology is another case. Having spawned active subfields like judgment, decision making, a turn to experiment, the field aims to go beyond the caricature of rational men to explain how humans make decisions. Continuing further, in the third paragraph, we see that what this change entails. It is important to underscore how this flips the way we think about economics. For generations, economists have presumed that people have interests, preferences in the neoclassical argot that get revealed in the course of people's choices. Interests come before actions and determine them. If you're hungry, you buy lunch. If you're cold, you get a sweater. If you only have so much money and can't afford to deal with both your growling stomach and your shivering, which need you choose to meet using your scarce savings reveals your preference. This is the traditional sense of economy. The modern sense is seen from a psychologist's perspective. Psychologists take one look at this simple formulation and shake their heads. Increasingly, even some mainstream economists have to admit that Homo economicus, this is an important term because there is a question on this, doesn't always behave like the textbook maximizer. Irrational behavior can't simply be waved away as extra economic expression of passions over interests, and thus the domains of other disciplines. This one place where the humanist can help the economist, if narrative economics is going to help us understand how rivals duke it out, who wins, who loses, who's going to need much more than lessons from epidemiological studies of viruses and intracranial stimuli. So again, this talks about the psychological view, the humanist view, pathological view, as given by the last statement, of economy, how economics can benefit from these different perspectives. Finally, the last paragraph, it says, above all, we need politics and institutions. So this talks about the political influence on economics. Schiller, the Nobel Prize winning economist, connects perceptions of narrative to change in behavior and thence to social outcomes. He completes a circle that was key to behavioral economics, brings in storytelling to make sense of how perceptions get framed. This cycle, perception to behavior to society, was once mediated or dominated by institutions, the political parties, lobby groups, and media organizations that played a vital role in legitimating, representing, and excluding interests. Yet, institutions have been stripped from Schiller's account to reveal a bare dynamic of emotions and economics. The passage ends by saying, without the intermediate place of politics. So the last paragraph talks about Schiller, talks about the connection between sociopolitics and economics. Let us look at the questions. Question 2 refers to a statement. It is interesting to note that earlier, in the previous years, till 2023, the cat would often tell you that this is a line from this paragraph. In 2024, we have not seen that courtesy. Times have changed for the once almighty discipline. We can infer from this statement and the associated paragraph that the author is being. We see this was from the second paragraph. Times have changed. The first paragraph talks about how economists would often, traditionally, economists would often look towards other fields, implement economics on other fields, but they would not borrow from other fields. So it was a one-way or one-directional exchange. Economics would influence others, but economists would not let other fields influence economics. Times have changed. The economists now they are actively seeking out collaborations with other fields. So looking at the options, we can infer from this statement and the associated paragraph that the author is being critical of economists openly borrowing and collaborating across disciplines to explain how humans make decisions. Incorrect. The author is supportive. The author would like there to be. The author makes note of how initially economists were being imperial. They were not letting other fields influence them when economics was still influencing other fields. So the author is not at all critical of economists openly borrowing and collaborating across disciplines. The author would prefer that economists borrow and collaborate across disciplines. B says judgmental about the ability of economic tools to accurately manage crises, leading to the downfall of this lofty science. The economic tools, their ability to manage crises, leading to the downfall, none of this is mentioned in that paragraph. The core idea is that now economists are letting economics be influenced by other fields. So again, B is incorrect. Disparaging of economists' inability to precisely predict market behavior and are now borrowing from other disciplines to remedy this. Borrowing from other disciplines, yes, somewhat close, but it's not because they want to remedy this situation that they are unable to precisely predict market behavior. So we find that C is also incorrect. We can rule it out. D says, sarcastic about how economists who earlier shunned other disciplines are now beginning to incorporate them in their analyses. Exactly what we needed. Initially, earlier, first paragraph, economists, they shunned other disciplines, but now they are beginning to incorporate these. They are actively seeking out collaborations with other fields. So the correct answer to question 2, the first question here, is D. Next up, question 3 says, we can infer from the passage that the term Homo economicus refers to someone who. Homo economicus was from the 4th paragraph. Let's look that up. We see that here. Psychologists take one look at this simple formulation and shake their heads. Increasingly, even some mainstream economists have to admit that Homo economicus doesn't always behave like the textbook maximizer. So that means that Homo economicus is someone who generally behaves like a maximizer, one who maximizes the fulfillment of their needs. That is the idea that's given here in the previous paragraph, where interests come before actions. If one is hungry, one can buy lunch. If one is cold, one can buy a sweater. If there's not enough money, then you have to prioritize one. Which one you prioritize reveals your preference. That said, Homo economicus doesn't always behave like the textbook maximizer. Irrational behavior can't simply be waved away as extra economic expression of passions over interests, and thus the domain of other disciplines, which means that Homo economicus is a person who is generally, not always, that's what this reference says, but generally known to be a maximizer of their interests, one who uh, has rational behavior which is aimed at maximizing their interests, the fulfillment of their interests. Let us look at the questions, or rather the options. So the term, we can infer from the passage that the term Homo economicus refers to someone. Yet again, we see that this does not point out where the reference is. The reference does not have a hyphen. It is not hyphenated. There's no quotation marks, single or double. So it is somewhat difficult to find the thing. In any case, A says maximizing their opportunities based on non-market choices. Non-market choices, not quite relevant to this context. The context of Homo economicus makes rational decisions based on their own preferences. This is correct. Someone who generally makes rational decisions based on their own preferences. The two things that we saw from there: preferences, because maximizer, and we cannot always explain irrational behavior, which means that generally we can explain rational decisions or rational behavior in terms of a Homo economicus. So B is a valid choice. We can qualify it. C tells us believes in borrowing and collaborating with other disciplines. This is true in terms of economists, not Homo economicus. Homo economicus is a common subject that economists would study. That's the common man by the economic perspective. This is completely irrelevant. So C is incorrect. D says is not influenced by the preference and choice of others. Preferences and choices not influenced is incorrect. We are talking about someone who is influenced by their preferences, someone who makes rational decisions. Choice of others, we cannot be sure about this because this is not given in the context, at least in that paragraph. So again, D is out. The correct answer here is option B. Next up, in the first paragraph, the author is making the point that economists like Becker, we know what Becker was doing. Becker was letting economics influence other areas, but he wouldn't let economics be influenced by other areas. He would not let other areas influence or benefit economics. That is what the first paragraph is talking about, where economists go into other subjects. When they cross borders, they do so with the intention of invading their garden plots. If necessary, one can always go back to the passage and read the reference. Anyways, so Becker had begun to borrow concepts from other disciplines, but were averse to the latter applying economic principles. Had begun to borrow concepts from other disciplines, incorrect. Becker would let other disciplines borrow concepts from economics, not the other way around. So this is wrong. B says, benefited from the application of their principles and concepts to non-economic phenomena. It was not Becker who benefited from the application of so there was benefit from the application of economic principles and concepts to non-economic phenomena, but it was not Becker who benefited. It was rather other fields, other areas, other disciplines who benefited. Also, Becker did not let his own field, economics, benefit from borrowing from other fields. So yet again, this is incorrect. Meaning B is not the answer. Used economics to analyze non-market behavior without incorporating perspectives from other areas of inquiry. Yes, if we check, non-market behavior was mentioned. We have taken note of that. Economic perspective was market behavior. Becker used the economic perspective, market behavior, to understand or to apply apply it to concepts of non-market behavior, which is non-economic aspects. So economy influencing other subjects, other disciplines. That's what this is talking about, which is true, without incorporating perspectives from other areas of inquiry into economics. This is precisely what we had been talking about. So this is a valid choice. D says, tended to guard their discipline from poaching by academics by other subject areas. Somewhat true that Becker would not let other areas influence economics, but there was no aspect of poaching. It was rather a control that economics would influence others, others would not influence economy. So the argument of poaching and all is too strong. There's no such thing mentioned in the passage, which means that this is a baseless assumption. While it comes close, at least this aspect of poaching is a baseless assumption. This is incorrect. The correct answer is C. Finally, the last question. We see here, the author critiques Schiller's approach to behavioral economics for. Schiller's approach is given in the last paragraph, where we are talking about the confluence of sociopolitics and economics. Here, the author critiques the approach for ignoring the marginal role that media and politics play in influencing people's behavior. In fact, let us look at the reference one more time. We see here, it is mentioned, this is where the concepts of Schiller, the concepts propounded by Schiller are given. He completes a circle that was key to behavioral economics and brings in storytelling to make sense of how perceptions get framed. This cycle, perceptions to behavior to society, was once mediated, dominated by institutions, the political parties, lobby groups, media organizations that played a vital role in legitimating, representing, and excluding interests. Yet we see this is where the author disagrees with Schiller. Yet institutions have been stripped from Schiller's account to reveal a bare dynamic of emotions and economics without the intermediating place of politics. So basically it takes emotions, economics, social aspects, but it doesn't quite pay attention to political aspects. Let's look at the options again. Ignoring the marginal role that media and politics play in influencing people's behavior. Politics, yes. Media, not so much. So this is incorrect. Relying excessively on storytelling as the main influence on the formation of perception. Storytelling was mentioned, but this is not mentioned as a problem. Storytelling was mentioned to be, this is the methodology. The problem was that it did not quite consider the socio-political outcome. So not B. Linking emotions and rational behavior without considering the mediation of social institutions. Yes, linking of emotions and rational behavior without considering the mediation of social institutions. This is not mentioned exactly like that, but we were talking about the confluence of sociopolitics. So social institutions, political institutions, they're both omitted in that concept, which means C is close. It comes as a valid choice. Let's see if there is an option which specifically speaks of political institutions or political aspects. D says denigrating the role of institutions while creating a link between behavioral economics and perceptions. We're not Schiller was not denigrating the role of institutions. It was not looking up or not considering socio-political institutions. There is no aspect of denigration. There's no aspect of insulting or demeaning any institution. It was just something ignored. So D is incorrect. The correct answer is option C. Let us move on to the next passage. For our second passage, let us look at a passage which is somewhat more interesting as compared to, say, challenging. This is a passage from the second shift of CAT 2024, the afternoon shift. This talks about the spice trade, historically speaking, particularly from the medieval times. Spices were a global commodity centuries before European voyages. This talks about the spice trade in the past, particularly from the European perspective. The passage is written from the European perspective, or the author speaks rather aligned with the European perspective. But we see medieval period actually introduced here in the second paragraph. The first paragraph is more of a historical perspective in general. There was a complex chain of relations, yet consumers had little knowledge of producers and vice versa. Desire for spices helped fuel European colonial empire to create political, military, and commercial networks under a single power. We see that this is an important aspect because it says desire for spices helped fuel European colonial empire. So colonialism, at least from the perspective of Europeans, was inspired originally by a desire for spices. Historians know a fair amount about the supply of spices in Europe during the medieval period. This is where we see medieval period first mentioned. The origins, methods of transportation, the prices, but less about demand. Why go to such extraordinary efforts to procure expensive product from exotic lands? Still, demand was great enough to inspire the voyages of Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, launching the first fateful wave of European colonialism. Once again, we tally that same idea. European colonialism, the first wave of European colonialism was inspired by the desire, the demand for spices. The third paragraph then explains this demand, why there was such a demand, or at least tries to explain. So why were spices so highly prized in Europe in the centuries from about 1000 to 1500? One widely disseminated explanation for medieval demand for spices was that they covered the taste of spoiled meat. So first one, they covered the taste of spoiled meat. Medieval purchasers consumed meat much fresher than what the average city dweller in the developed world of today has at hand. However, refrigeration was not available, and some hot spices have been shown to serve as an antibacterial agent. Salting, smoking, or drying meat were other means of preservation. So we see one aspect covering the taste of spoiled meat. Second aspect, preservation of meat. Most spices used in cooking began as medical ingredients. We see the third argument or the third reason, which is the medical application of spices. Most spices used in cooking began as medical ingredients, and throughout the Middle Ages, spices were used as both medicines and condiments. Above all, medieval recipes involved the combination of medical and culinary lore in order to balance food's humoral properties and prevent disease. So one final aspect at the end, most spices were hot and dry and so appropriate in sauces to counteract the moist and wet properties supposedly possessed by most meat and fish. So you see the last factor is there was a taste aspect. Yes, spoiled meat, covering the taste of spoiled meat, preserving meat from getting spoiled, medical applications for treating illnesses, etc., or preventing disease at the very least. We see that here. But there's also the aspect of taste or culinary experience or culinary preferences, we see that most spices were hot and dry, and so appropriate in sauces in order to counteract the moist and wet properties supposedly possessed by most meat. After this, we see that the passage then continues with the argument of where spices comes from. And in this, there's a very interesting, very funny, rather, explanation of the misconception that Europeans of the medieval period had about the East, particularly India. Where spices come from was known in a vague sense centuries before the voyages of Columbus. Just how vague may be judged by looking at medieval world maps. To the medieval European imagination, the East was exotic and alluring. Medieval maps often placed India close to the so-called earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden described in Bible. So India was this mythical land which is India and the Garden of Eden, right next to each other. Geographical knowledge has a lot to do with the perception of spices' relative scarcity and the reasons for their high prices. An example of the varying notions of scarcity is the conflicting information about how pepper is harvested. As far back as the 7th century, Europeans thought that pepper in India grew on trees guarded by serpents that would bite and poison anyone who attempted to gather the fruit. The only way to harvest pepper was to burn the trees, which would drive the snakes underground. Of course, this bit of lore would explain the shriveled black peppercorns, but not white, pink, or other colors. Finally, at the end, the author concludes by saying, spices never had the enduring allure or power of gold and silver, or the commercial potential of new products such as tobacco, indigo, and sugar. But the taste for spices did continue for a while beyond the Middle Ages. As late as the 17th century, the English and the Dutch were struggling for control of spice islands. Dutch New Amsterdam or New York was exchanged by the British for one of the Moluccan islands where nutmeg was grown. So entire islands were traded just to get access to spice. So for example, nutmeg in this example. So we have understood all of that. Let us go to the questions. Question 3 says, that's the first question in this sequence. In the context of the passage, which one of the following conclusions cannot be reached? This is an except type question. We are looking for something which cannot be concluded from the given information. India was colonized for its spices and gold. We don't know that. First off, we don't know if India was colonized. Yes, it was. Europeans colonized. But here, India is only mentioned as a source of spice. It is not directly mentioned in the passage that India was colonized. We were also talking about European colonialism, but we don't quite see this as a confirmation or as definitive data. Second, what was India colonized for? Spices, very likely, yes, because pepper from India. The entire story about what European people thought was how pepper was harvested from India. There were snakes in trees and whatnot. And gold. Gold is only mentioned in the last paragraph. There's no connection between gold and India. So this we cannot be sure of. Oh, rather, this is an except type question. We cannot reach this conclusion, which means A is actually a valid choice. Colonialism was motivated by the demand for spices. Yes, first paragraph, second paragraph. We have taken note of this. This is very true, can be inferred, can be concluded from the information given. Tobacco was more marketable than spices. Yes, gold and silver, last paragraph. Gold and silver had more enduring value, and tobacco, indigo, etc., sugar, they had more commercial value. So they were more marketable than spices. So this also can be concluded from the passage, not a valid choice. The spice trade was a driver of colonial expansion. Same argument as option B. Colonialism was, at least in the context of Europe, colonialism was inspired by the spice trade. Initial waves of colonialism were inspired by the spice trade. So not this, the correct answer is option A. Question 4. In the context of the passage, the people who heard the story of pepper trees being guarded by snakes, this is in the context of India, would be least likely to arrive at the conclusion that, yet again, this is an except type question, least likely to arrive at the conclusion that. So what would they not conclude? Which of the following would they not conclude from the story about how pepper was harvested from trees guarded by snakes in India? Option A says, this is why pepper is so hot. Already the answer. Because there the thing was pepper was harvested from trees which were guarded by snakes. To harvest the pepper, these trees had to be burnt, which is why pepper, like peppercorns, were black. Did not explain the white ones, the pink ones. But that meant that it was difficult to harvest. It was dangerous to harvest. But what about hotness? What about how spicy or hot pepper was? There's no mention of that in the context of India and snakes and how the pepper was harvested. So already this is something that people who, Europeans, let's say, who read the story of pepper trees from India guarded by snakes, they are not likely to deduce this. Black peppercorns, yes, because the trees were burnt. It is expensive. It is not so widely available. There's very little supply because it is so difficult to gain it, so dangerous to get it. But why are peppers hot? No connection given, or no relation to India or how it is harvested given. So this is a valid choice. A is a valid choice. B says it is no surprise that the pepper supply is so limited. Yes, it is dangerous to get pepper from these trees in India. Trees are guarded by snakes, and you have to burn the trees down to drive the snakes away. So this is something that the said people who heard the story or knew the story of the pepper trees being guarded by snakes, they're likely to come to this conclusion. B is not a valid choice. C, it is not advisable to go to India to harvest pepper themselves. Obviously, they don't want to go to a land where snakes protect, guard trees. Be dangerous. It is dangerous. So also likely to come to this conclusion. Not the answer. Pepper is costly for good reason. Yes, because its supply is low, because it is so dangerous and so exotic. It is difficult and dangerous to get it from India, trees guarded by snakes. So this is also a conclusion that they are likely to arrive at. Not the answer. The answer here again is option A. Question 5 says, if a trader brought white peppercorn from India to medieval Europe, all of the following are unlikely to happen except. Yet again, we're looking at an except type question. So which of the following is unlikely to happen? That is the subject of the question, but we have the except, which means we're looking for something that is likely to happen. This is when a trader would bring white peppercorn from India to medieval Europe. We see the reference from the same paragraph as the one that talks about India. This is the second last paragraph, which talks about geographical knowledge and its effect on the perception of spices. We see here the only way to harvest pepper was to burn the trees, which would drive the snakes underground. Of course, this bit of lore would explain the shriveled black peppercorns, but not white, pink, or other colors. So if someone did bring white peppercorn from India, then people would doubt this story that the trees actually needed to be burnt down. If probably there were no snakes. So looking at the options, all of the following are unlikely to happen except, so what is likely to happen in this scenario if a trader brought white peppercorns from India to medieval Europe? What is likely to happen? The prices of spices would decrease. No, it is still a faraway land. I mean, in reality, the trees were not guarded by snakes, etc. People thought they did, but in reality, that was not true. Even so, it was a voyage away. It was a different continent altogether. And so bringing peppercorns from there, they would still be of rare supply. Their supply would be limited and they would still be rare. They would still be exotic. They'd still be expensive. So we don't necessarily know that the prices would decrease. Not necessarily so. So we cannot say that this is likely to happen. Pepper would no longer be considered exotic. Again, pepper is still exotic. The definition of exotic is something which is not indigenous. In Europe, pepper which has been brought from a different continent altogether across the ocean after a sea voyage is definitely exotic. So this is altogether incorrect. Not likely to happen. Europeans would doubt the story of pepper harvesting. Yes, because the story requires that trees be burned down. Hence the black peppercorns, shriveled black peppercorns. But these peppercorns are from India and they're white. That means the trees were not burnt down. So C is a valid choice. Medieval maps would be used as navigational aids. Medieval maps were mentioned in this, but medieval maps were not directly connected to the idea of this misconception about how pepper is harvested in India, how pepper trees were guarded by snakes and the trees had to be burned down, hence the black peppercorns, or why are there then white peppercorns or pink ones or other colors, etc., etc. Medieval maps spoke of a misconception about India, but it was a different misconception. Medieval maps showed India placed nearby the Garden of Eden or the land of Eden. So that is a different thing that has no connection with this. Again, this is not likely to happen. So D can be ruled out. The correct answer is C. Finally, the last question, question 6. It can be inferred that all of the following contributed to a decline in the allure of spices, except. In order to see this, we have to see why there was a desire for spices. This is given by the third paragraph. The third paragraph, it directly answers this question. So why were spices so highly prized? And we've already marked the reasons. The first reason was it covered the taste of spoiled meat. This is reason number 1. Then refrigeration was not available. Some hot spices have been shown to serve as an antibacterial bacterial agent, salting, smoking. So there was the idea of antibacterial property. There was the idea of preservation of meat. This is point number 2 or reason number 2. The third reason is the medical application of spices. And the fourth reason is that it fitted the culinary preferences of the time better. So most spices were hot and dry and so appropriate in sauces to counteract the moist and wet properties. So appropriate for sauces. This is reason number 4. Now, once there was these were the reasons why there was a desire, such a desire for spices. One could infer that if there was a decline in the allure of spices, the desire for spices, it must have been because these reasons were eliminated, these factors were mitigated. Let's see which ones. This is also an except type passage, so except type question. So we realize this passage has all 4 except type questions, which is very interesting. But we are looking for something which is not something that would contribute to a decline in the allure of spices. Changes in the system of medical treatment. Spices used for medical reasons or for their medical properties is given as one of the reasons why there was desire. If there were changes in the system, the improvements in the system of medical treatments, then it is likely that the need for spices for their medical properties would reduce. So this would contribute to a decline in the allure of spices, not what we are looking for. The development of refrigeration techniques. Yes, preservation of meat, preservation of food was one requirement. That was required in medieval times because refrigeration techniques did not exist. Refrigeration was not available. When refrigeration became available, in fact, this is mentioned in the modern time. In the modern time, the meat that purchasers buy, that is not as fresh as what people would buy during medieval times. But because there's availability of refrigeration, the meat still, even if it is not fresh, it does not spoil for a longer period of time. So development of refrigeration definitely would have contributed to reduction in the allure of spices. Not the answer we're looking for. Increase in the availability of spices. Now, we do see that there are some references in the passage that spices were rare, exotic, and so they were expensive. But that is not mentioned in the third paragraph as a reason why they were so highly desired. So this is a valid choice because this does not connect to a desire for spices. This is not given as a reason for desire for spices where desire for spices is mentioned. So we cannot consider this to be a reason for decline in the desire for spices when this change happens. C is a valid choice. We can qualify it. Changes in European cuisine. European cuisine relating to the fourth factor. Spices were hot and dry, so they were appropriate for sauces. If there was change in European cuisine, this could very well have contributed to a decline in the allure of spices, which means this is also not an answer, not a valid choice. The answer here is option C. So that concludes our second paragraph. This was something a bit more manageable, to suggest that in CAT, the RCs are not impossible. These questions were easy to medium at best. The passage was somewhat difficult. One could call it a medium passage, but it was still interesting to read. So we have to understand the CAT very much depends upon the proper selection of passages. One does not have to answer all questions in the CAT. The CAT exam is as much about leaving out questions, about leaving questions unanswered, as it is about answering questions. The most appropriate strategy is to answer 2 to 3 passages in the first section, the VARC section, and then some more VA questions. So this gives us the idea that given the right selection, we could have picked up this passage because it is interesting and gotten most of these questions, if not all of them, correct. But that said, there are tougher questions. Now, for the third passage, let's look at something a bit more challenging so that we can see the other side of the spectrum. Here we go. For our third passage, let us take something a bit more challenging. This is a passage from the first shift, the morning shift of CAT 2024. This talks about craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is mentioned in the sense of it being opposed to mass production. Mass production is efficiency. Craftsmanship is more like handmade things, individually made things, artisanal products. That we see here that this clearly talks about creativity. The first paragraph begins by saying, the idea of craftsmanship is not simply nostalgic. Crafts require distinctive skills, an all-round approach to work that involves the whole product rather than individual parts, an attitude that necessitates devotion to the job, focus on the communal interest. The concept of craft emphasizes the human touch and individual judgment. We see in the second paragraph that this is then proposed to be opposed to the ethos of management, which focuses on efficiency. The craft concept seems to run against the preponderant ethos of management studies, which, as the academics note, have long prioritized efficiency and consistency. So we see that these two ideas, they are opposed to each other. If we make a mental note of this, or if we make actual notes of it to mind map the passage, then we see here that we are talking about one, creativity on one end of the spectrum and efficiency on the other end of the spectrum. Creativity is involved with craftsmanship, or craft for short. So we see that here. The field of craftsmanship or craft, that has to do more with creativity versus what is prioritized in the field of management is efficiency. We see that here. So this is management. And we'll realize that this is also true in the case of mass production or corporate production, so factory production. That is an argument from the third paragraph. We'll get there. So we see here, the craft concept seems to run against the preponderant ethos of management studies, which, as the academics note, have long prioritized efficiency and consistently. Craft skills were portrayed as being primitive and traditionalist. So craft is very clearly against the ethos of management, which focuses on or prioritizes efficiency and consistency. The contrast between artisanship and efficiency first came to fore in the 19th century. So this talks about when this contrast came into being. And this particularly talks about when first this idea of mass production came into existence. So in the 19th century, when British manufacturers suddenly faced competition from across the Atlantic as firms developed the American system using standardized parts. From standardized parts, we see that this talks about mass production and standardization and efficiency, but not in terms of craftsmanship, opposed to craftsmanship. Creativity missing from this. The worldwide success of the Singer sewing machine showed the potential of a mass-produced device. This process created its own reaction, first in the form of arts and craft movement of the late 19th century, then again in the small is beautiful movement of the 1970s. A third crafts movement is emerging. We see here that this is emerging at present, is emerging, as people become aware of the environmental impact of conventional industry. The fourth paragraph then says why this third craft movement is emerging, or rather, what is the reason for their existing a market for crafts product. If mass production can produce things more efficiently in a more standardized manner, why doesn't exist? Why does a market for craftsmanship or crafts products exist? Because of two reasons. The two potential markets for those who practice crafts. There are two potential markets for those who practice crafts. The first stems from the existence of consumers who are willing to pay a premium price for goods that are deemed to be of extra quality. The second market lies. So first is people who are willing to pay a premium, people who are willing to pay more to get goods that they deem to be of extra quality. Second market lies in those consumers who wish to use their purchases to support local workers or to reduce their environmental impact by taking goods to craftspeople to be mended or recycled. So one is people who prefer to have their products made by or purchase products from local craftsmen because of again because of within it because of two reasons. One, to reduce the environmental impact. Second, to support local workers. And we can see that these are the reasons why there is this third crafts movement at present. It is emerging, so it is in the present. The fifth paragraph says, for workers, the appeal of, just a moment. So we've seen how the fourth paragraph, it talks about the two potential markets. So this is the importance of crafts or the significance or application of crafts from a buyer's point of view. Then we see from a worker's point of view. For workers, the appeal of craftsmanship is that it allows them the autonomy to make creative choices and thus makes a job far more satisfying. In that sense, it could offer hope for the overall labor market. Let the machines automate dull and repetitive tasks and let workers focus purely on their skills, judgment, and imagination. So let workers focus on creative tasks and machines automate those tasks which are dull, boring, repetitive. As a current example, the academic site, the Agile Manifesto in the software sector, an industry at the heart of technological change, the pioneers behind the original Agile Manifesto promised to prioritize individuals and interactions over process and tools. By bringing together experts from different teams, Agile working is designed to improve creativity. So it doesn't quite tell us what the Agile model or what the Agile Manifesto is. It just says what all things it prioritizes. We'll keep that in mind if we face a question on that. Then we have this paragraph, the sixth paragraph, it says the broader question. So from the but, we realize that this is going to disagree with the current running argument, which is there being a crafts revival, and what are the reasons behind it? What are the potential markets? How does the population of buyers perceive crafts? How does the population of workers perceive crafts? But the broader question whether crafts can create more jobs than they do today. So the broader question is whether crafts can create a lot more jobs than they do today. Demand for crafted products may rise, but will it be easy to retain workers in sectors that might get automated, such as truck drivers, to take advantage? In a world where products and services often have to pass through regulatory hoops, large companies will usually have the advantage. History also says now we take another negative outlook towards craft, but towards the connection between craft and creativity, but this is from a historical perspective. This talks about the medieval crafts guilds where certain things existed. We'll see from the paragraph. History also says that the link between crafts and creativity is not automatic. It's not that craftsmanship is automatically and by nature it is creative. Medieval crafts guilds were monopolies which resisted new entrants. They were also highly hierarchical, with young men required to spend long periods of time as apprentices and journeymen before they could set up on their own. By that time, the innovative spirit may have been knocked out of them. Crafts workers can thrive in the modern era, but only if they don't get too organized. This is a very concluding and very significant argument. We'll keep that in mind. Craft workers can thrive in the modern era, but only if they don't get too organized, because we have the instance of there being too much organization in the medieval craft skills, and that was clearly bad. young craftsmen had to spend long periods as apprentices and journeymen before they could set up on their own. By that time, the innovative spirit may have been knocked out of them. By that time, they might have lost the creativity that got them into craftsmanship. So with that, let us look at the questions. Question 14 says, the author questions the ability of crafts to create substantial employment opportunities presently because this is a reference to the second last paragraph, the sixth paragraph, this one. And here we know that it is talking about large companies getting the advantage in the last statement. So first off, the connection is this, but the broader question is whether crafts can create a lot more jobs than they do today. So it is a question whether crafts can create a lot more jobs than they do today in the future. And that is not very likely because in a world where products and services often have to pass through regulatory hoops, large companies will usually have the advantage. So let us look at the options. Why does the author question the ability of crafts to create substantial employment opportunities in present? Because the low scale of crafts production will not be able to absorb the mass of redundant labor. Incorrect. At all, if we were talking about absorbing the mass of redundant labor, this was, say, from the example of truck drivers. But this is only mentioned as a question. We can see that here. Second statement, demand for crafted products may rise, but will it be easy to retrain workers in sectors that might get automated, such as truck drivers, to take advantage? Question mark. We don't know if this is even possible. So this may or may not be be a reason why the author questions crafts' ability to create sustainable or substantial employment. This is not, we are not certain about option A, not correct. Workers made redundant by automation are unlikely to opt for crafts-related work. Again, we don't know whether crafts would be able to retrain these workers, whether they would want to get into crafts or not. We have no idea. So option B is also incorrect. Option C tells us regulatory requirements could make it difficult for small crafts outfits to compete. Yes, because products and services have to go through regulatory hoops. This is from the last statement. We saw that large corporations, large companies would always have the advantage, which means that small crafts would have a disadvantage. Small crafts outfits would not be able to compete. This is exactly what the passage is telling us, only from the other perspective. It has flipped the perspective, but C is very much correct. Crafts guilds tend to resist new entrants and are unlikely to accept large number of trainees. This is completely irrelevant. We saw that crafts guilds were mentioned in the medieval time period from the historical perspective, from in a historical context. So this is from the last paragraph. The question is referring to the second last paragraph, and there is no direct connection between the two. So this is incorrect. We can rule it out. The correct answer for this question is option C. Next question. We can infer from the passage that medieval crafts guilds resembled mass production in that both. We've seen medieval crafts guilds in the last paragraph. The point to note here is this. History also says that the link between crafts and creativity is not automatic. This then is exemplified in medieval crafts guilds. These craft guilds were monopolies which resisted new entrants. They also were highly hierarchical, with young men required to spend long periods as apprentices and journeymen before they could set up on their own. By that time, the innovative spirit may have been knocked out of them. So these craft skills, they did not support creativity. They did not nurture creativity. In terms of mass production, this is not directly mentioned, but we can see some of that from the third paragraph right here, because the third paragraph specifically talks about mass production or mass-produced devices. The contrast between artisanship and efficiency. We know artisanship is talking about crafts, and efficiency is talking about the management model, which is mass production. Talking about efficiency, consistency, what we have established here. First came to the fore in the 19th century when British manufacturers suddenly faced competition from across the Atlantic as firms developed the American system using standardized parts. We see here that the core idea of the American system, mass production, efficiency, the management ethos of things is standardized parts. The worldwide success of the Singer sewing machine showed the potential of a mass-produced device. So yet again, then we see there are reactions talked about that. So we see here that this is talking about standardization, efficiency, consistency, speed in production, mass production, producing in bulk, but it doesn't talk about creativity, because creativity is a is an aspect of the field of crafts, of artisanship. So similar to crafts guilds, mass production, the process of mass production, the American system, the management ethos of efficiency and consistency, this does not nurture creativity. So let's get back to the question. We can infer from the passage that medieval crafts guilds resembled mass production in that both did not nurture creativity, discouraged innovation by restricting entry through strict rules. Discourage innovation, yes, if we correlate innovation to creativity, but by restricting entry, not really. True for crafts guilds, not for mass production. In mass production, it is not mentioned that there is a restriction on entry. It's just that it focuses on standardization, it focuses on bulk production, efficiency and consistency, not creativity. So this part of it is outside the premise. Did not necessarily promote creativity. Yes, we saw this in both cases. Did not necessarily promote creativity. One was focused on the mass production was focused on efficiency and consistency rather than creativity. And the crafts guilds, they would have these apprentices, these young men who wanted to be craftsmen. They would have to remain apprentices and journeymen for so long that by the time they actually set up a crafts shop or a crafts workshop of their own, the creativity might have been knocked out of them. So this is consistent with the passage. Focused excessively on product quality. Product quality in the case of mass production is mentioned in general because we're talking about the sewing machine, the Singer sewing machine. Product quality is mentioned in terms of the reason why there's a revival in crafts, because people there are certain people who would wish to pay a premium for products which they deem to be of higher quality, but that is not the core difference between the two. We see that crafts guilds, in the case of crafts guilds, we were not necessarily talking about product quality. So this is not a key difference between, or rather a key similarity between the two. D says, did not always employ egalitarian production processes. Egalitarian, based on equality, production processes. First off, production process is something that we don't know in the case of crafts guilds. It is definitely known in the case of mass production because mass production is a production process. But in that, are we talking about egalitarian, equality-based? Mass production is producing in bulk. How is it equality-based? Even if we equate the two. Mass production, as in everything is consistent, because consistency was mentioned over there. If everything is consistent and we generalize by saying consistency equals equality, then also this is true. Then also, it's a big stress, but then also this is true only of mass production, not of craft skills. So again, this is not quite correct. We don't see this as a point of similarity between the two. We can rule this out. The correct answer is option B. Let's go to the next question. Question 16. The most recent revival in interest in the crafts is a result of the emergence of all of the following except. This is an except type question. We have to find something which is not a reason for the most recent revival in interest in crafts. We know that there was this mention of the recent revival in crafts revival. This was at the end of the third paragraph, if I remember correctly. Let's check. The most recent revival, this is what we are talking about. So we are only talking about the recent revival. There were other ones which were mentioned belonging to the past, but we are not concerned about those. Looking up the reference, we see that the third paragraph talks about the revival. The first is the form of the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century, but this does not count because late 19th century. Then again, in the small is beautiful movement of the 1970s, again, doesn't count because 1970s. A third craft movement, this is what counts because it is emerging at present. So the most recent one is this one. The third crafts movement is emerging as people become aware of the environmental impact. So once understood, this aspect, this third crafts movement is emerging because one reason, people become aware of the environmental impact of conventional industry. And then we see that this crafts movement is emerging because, or in other words, we can say that there is a potential market for crafts products or people who practice crafts because. So we see this actually gives us a reasoning why there is a third crafts movement emerging. The two potential reasons or the two potential markets are thus. The first stems from the existence of consumers who are willing to pay a premium price for goods that are deemed to be of extra quality. So people who think that certain handmade goods would be of extra quality or maybe characteristic, they would be willing to pay a premium. There is one potential market for crafts products or people who practice crafts. The second market lies in those consumers who wish to use their purchases to support local workers in order to also reduce their environmental impact by taking goods to craftspeople to be mended or recycled. So one, to support local workers, second, to reduce their environmental impact, also paying a premium for to procure goods that are deemed to be of extra quality. These three things are the reasons that we see here. The same as the environmental issue mentioned here is also mentioned here. So that is a common issue. We understand that. Returning to the question, we see that we are looking for something that is not a reason for the most recent revival. A says concerns about the environmental impact of mass production. This is very much one of the issues. So A is not the answer that we're looking for. Support for individual creation as opposed to mass-produced objects. Now, this is mentioned in the case of the first two revivals. The third paragraph, it talked about mass production, the Singer sewing machine, the American methodology, the American process. In that, mass production was mentioned. Mass production had its there was a reaction towards it in the first arts and crafts movement. Then there was another reaction towards it in the 1970s in the small is beautiful. And then at present, there is the third movement. This relates to the first two movements at best, does not connect with the third movement. The third movement talked about one, products which were handmade crafts created, which were deemed to be of higher quality. Second was reducing the environmental impact. Third was supporting local producers or small manufacturers, etc. This does not fall into that category, which means B is a valid choice. A niche market for discerning buyers of quality products, products which were deemed to be of higher quality, people who were willing to pay extra, pay a premium for this supposed high quality. This is very much a reason for the revival, the recent revival. C is not a valid choice. A greater interest in buying locally produced goods, again, supporting local producers. So this is also a reason for the recent revival, not a valid choice. The answer here is B. Finally, question 17. Again, we can see that this is another except type question, does not use the word except, it says not here. The question is a bit confusing. The question is of a double twist format. Which one of the following statements is not inconsistent with the view stated in the passage? Not inconsistent. Let us understand. Most cases, we might be a little cautious when dealing with very hard questions or very confusing questions. But in most cases, when we have a phrase like this, it can be simplified. The double negative, not and then inconsistent. This suggests that we are talking about the double negative will make it a positive. The not and inconsistent, the negative and the inconsistent would cancel out. What we are saying is that it will be consistent. Let's say, to explain this, to clarify this, let's say we have the word true. True, something which is true, something which is correct. Opposite of that is untrue. Untrue equates to false. Now, if we take untrue and put a not in front of it, not untrue equals not false. What is not false is essentially true. So when you have the double negative, you can just cancel it out make the positive of the given phrase. So not inconsistent, the not inconsistent negatives will cancel out. We are looking for something that is consistent with the information given in the passage, with the views stated in the passage. Let's see. We need to support the crafts. Only then can we retain the creativity intrinsic to their production, not mentioned in the passage. So we don't know if this is consistent or inconsistent. We cannot draw a judgment. The passage talks about crafts, creativity, where the revivals in crafts originated from, what was the time when craft versus management, where creativity versus efficiency and consistency came to the forefront. This contrast came to the forefront. What is the present day perspective of buyers towards craft? What is the present day perspective of craftsmen, of workers towards craft? What is the historical perspective on crafts? We don't see the author suggests that we need to support craft anywhere in the passage. So this is outside the premise. We don't know if this is true or false. This is likely because the author speaks so much about craft. It is likely that the author is in support of crafts, but we cannot draw that judgment for sure. This is not the answer choice we're looking for. Creativity in the crafts could be stifled if the market for artisan goods becomes too organized. Creativity in the crafts could be stifled if market for artisan goods becomes too organized. This is very true. We see this from the very last statement. After we talk about crafts guilds, etc., the historical perspective, the author then connects this to the present or the modern day, the present day scenario of crafts by saying this. Crafts workers can thrive in the modern era, but only if they don't get too organized. If they get too organized, then crafts would be stifled or creativity would be stifled, because we see here that in the medieval craft skills, there's an example of too much organization, too much hierarchy, stifling creativity. By that time, the innovative spirit may have been knocked out of them. So we find that this is a valid choice. We had eliminated option A. B is true, consistent with the last statement of the passage. C tells us the arts and crafts movement was initially inspired by the American system of production. Third paragraph, American system of production is basically mass production. Arts and crafts movement was a reaction against the American system. American system, mass production. Arts and crafts opposed to that. It was not inspired by the American system of production. So this is a distortion, not consistent with the passage. Not what we require. The agile movement in software is a throwback to the tenets of the medieval craft skills. Agile movement was mentioned in the fourth or fifth paragraph. The medieval craft skills is in the last paragraph. The medieval craft skills is the historical perspective. Agile movements is more in the present. Maybe not in the present, but it is more of a modern thing as compared to the medieval craft skills. There's no direct connection between the two. So this is wrong. This is incorrect. The correct answer here again is B. So that concludes this passage as well. Let's try one more before we go on to the verbal part of things. Here we go. For our last passage, let us jaunt through a passage which is somewhat difficult, questions which are somewhat difficult, yet they can be understood, they can be decoded, demystified, and still managed. It is once we understand this idea, the central premises given in the passage, these questions would not be very challenging. At first glance, they can seem like so, but we realize that's not necessarily the case. This is a passage from the third shift, the evening shift of CAT 2024. This talks about the demise of, the extinction of languages, or languages becoming endangered. It is given in the first two paragraphs. What are the reasons behind it? Languages become endangered and die out for many reasons, but mostly two are mentioned. Sadly, the physical annihilation of communities of native speakers of a language is all too often the cause of language extinction. So the first reason is the physical annihilation of communities of native speakers. If native speakers just die, there are no people left who speak a certain native language, then obviously the language is dead. Some examples are given. North America, European colonists brought death and destruction to many Native American communities. This was followed by US federal policies restricting the use of indigenous languages, including the removal of native children from their communities to federal boarding schools. We see that this was added to when US federal policies, they restricted the use of indigenous languages. Native children were removed from their communities and put in federal boarding schools. So, federal boarding schools, where in all probability they would be taught in English, the medium of teaching would be the English language, they would not practice. The children, the next generation of people learning the language, would not practice the language. And so eventually, this language would just die because it has gone out of common knowledge. Where native languages and cultural practices were prohibited, as many as 75% of the languages spoken in the territories that became the United States have gone extinct, with slightly better language survival rates in Central or South America. So, Central or South America has slightly better language survival. North America, it has seen largely a demise of up to 75% of the languages spoken. These are the reasons. One, death and destruction brought by Americans, Europeans, where people, the native speakers of a language, they just died. And then uh, children from these communities were taken from the communities and put into federal schools, boarding schools, where the native language culture was prohibited. Next up, the passage says there are some other reasons. So the second reason is mentioned here. Even without physical annihilation prohibitions against language use, the language of the dominant culture may drive out languages into extinction. So competition between languages where one becomes dominant, most prominently spoken, most commonly spoken, is another reason. This dominant culture, the dominant culture of the language, of the dominant language, may drive other language into extinction. Young people see education, jobs, culture, and technology associated with the dominant language and focus their attention. This kind of talks about brain drain, where we think that everything English or everything American is good. American education, jobs, culture, etc., technology, etc., etc. Similar kind of an argument. With the dominant language and focus their attention on that language. The largest language killers are English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, Hindi, and Chinese, all of which have privileged status as dominant languages threatening minority languages. The next paragraph, the third paragraph, this talks about what happens, what is one of the costs of losing a language. This particularly mentions that when language is lost, then of course the language is lost. The language goes extinct, but there's some other factor which also, there's something in the environment, something which is related to the culture of the speakers of that language, which is also lost. When we lose a language, we lose the worldview, culture, and knowledge of the people who spoke it, contributing a loss to all humanity. People around the world live in direct contact with their native environments, their habitat. When the language they speak goes extinct, the rest of humanity loses their knowledge of that environment, their wisdom about the relationship between local plants' illnesses, their philosophical and religious beliefs, as well as their native cultural expression in music, visual art, poetry that has enriched both the speakers of that language and others who would have encountered that culture. So some part of this culture, something which is put into words by that language, is also lost when a language becomes extinct. The fourth paragraph, it talks about how educators would perceive the loss of language and how they would respond. The fifth paragraph talks about how students would respond. We have a short sixth paragraph which surmises these two paragraphs particularly, because these two paragraphs, they talk about preservation, how people who are trained in the liberal arts may go about preserving language. Only the fourth paragraph is from the perspective of educators, fifth paragraph from the perspective of students. As educators deeply immersed in the liberal arts, we believe that educating students broadly in all facets of language and culture yields immense rewards. Some individuals educated in the liberal arts tradition will pursue advanced studies in linguistics and become actively engaged in language preservation, setting out for the Amazon. This is not Amazon.com, this is Amazon, the Amazon forest, the rainforest. Setting out for the Amazon, for example, with video recording equipment to interview the last surviving elders in a community, to record and document a language spoken by no children. So when no children speak a language, there are only some surviving elders in the community who speak that language. When those elders, already elders, when they die, eventually that language will go extinct. But then Certain educators, they believe in those who have been trained and those who have been immersed in the liberal arts, they believe that educating students broadly in all facets of language and culture yields immense reward. So they would do a lot. They would go to extreme lengths to protect language, to preserve language, setting out for the Amazon, for example, with video recording equipment to preserve this one language, this language. It's not a specific language that we're speaking about. It's just an example that one might even go to the Amazon to protect certain languages which are about to go extinct. Certainly, though, the vast majority of students will not pursue this kind of activity. For these students, it says here vast majority of students will not pursue this kind of activity, but even so, students would be interested in preserving. Only the preservation happens in a different way. The students who have been trained in these traditions, they would be able to integrate these languages more into their own culture, the languages into their languages, the culture into their own culture, and thus be able to preserve this this particular native language or culture that is endangered, that is about to die. For these students, a liberal arts education is absolutely critical from the twin perspective of language extinction and global citizenship. When students study languages other than their own, they are sensitized to the existence of different cultural perspectives and practices. They are sensitized to the different cultural perspectives, practices. With such an education, students are more likely to be able to articulate insights into their own cultural biases, be more empathetic to individuals of other cultures, communicate successfully across linguistic and cultural differences, consider and resolve questions in a way that reflects multiple cultural perspectives, and ultimately extend support to people, programs, practices, policies that support preservation of endangered language. So even in this case, the students who've been trained in liberal arts, they would not act, or they would not go to such extremes as educators to even go to some exotic and remote area to protect some language which is endangered. But they would not only understand languages better, they would also be able to understand cultural differences better, respect people from other cultures, respect the cultural differences, and then be able to integrate that culture into their own language, bridge cultural gaps because their thought process becomes more tolerant, more inclusive of other cultures because they have learned the language. There is ample evidence that such preservation, we see such preservation refers to both the previous two paragraphs, and in both cases, we are talking about preservation, can work in languages spiraling towards extinction. For example, Navajo, Cree, and Inuit communities have established schools in which these languages are the language of instruction, and the number of speakers of each has increased. So there are some instances where this kind of preservation has actually worked, particularly in the case of Navajo, Cree, and Inuit communities. Let's look at the questions. Question 12, the first here, it says, it can be inferred from the passage that it is likely South America had a slightly better language survival rate than North America for all of the following reasons, except. There's an except type question. We are looking for something which is not a reason for South America to have better language survival rate as compared to North America. This is a reference to the first paragraph. We remember from the first two paragraphs, we were talking about reasons why languages go extinct. In the case of North America, the two things that have been mentioned are, there is one, the death of all the native speakers of a language. European colonization brought death and destruction to North America. And the second is the misappropriation of the culture, where children from that community were taken away from the community, put into federal boarding schools. One other reason is given in the second paragraph that is not directly related to North America or South America, but that may be correlated. Let's see about that from the options. It may be correlated, which is when there is a dominant language, it can dominate and thus kill other languages out of just loss of practice. People emulating the dominant language, thus leaving their own native languages and cultures behind. So let us look at the answer choices. Remember, this is an except type question. We are looking for something which is not a likely reason for there being better survival rate, language survival rate in South America. European colonists allowed children of native speakers to stay home with their families. Children were not removed from their communities, not put into schools where other languages or the dominant languages or the colonizers' languages were emphasized. The children were allowed to stay in at home with their families, where the families would continue to speak the native language. This would very well be a reason why South America did not see so much death of language. So this is not a valid choice. We're looking for something which is not a likely reason. B says the colonial government was unable to mainstream the locals. Yes, once again, they were unable to mainstream the locals, which means the practice of speaking the language did not die out. The culture was not killed by appropriation by another culture, by the dominant culture, not the dominant language, still relevant to the first paragraph, where the dominant culture, where the colonizers did not mainstream the locals. So this is also a likely reason why, not the answer. Locals were provided job opportunities in the colonial administration. Now, this would definitely cause. This is something, one, relevant to the idea of a dominant language, which is given in the second paragraph, does not directly correlate with South America or North America. First thing. Second problem is this would cause there to be more language death or a lower language survival rate in South America. If locals were provided job opportunities in the colonial administration, then job opportunities would cause them to migrate towards the colonially spoken, the language that is spoken by the colonists. The colonists, the colonizers, they would speak their own language. In this case, European languages, let's say. If locals were given jobs, then they would emulate, in order to get those jobs, they would emulate the language, hence the culture of the colonizer, hence the dominant language will win out. This one does not correlate directly. Second, it does not correlate with North America and South America directly. Second, this is a reason why there would be death of languages. So this would be a likely cause for lower language survival rate, which means this is a valid choice. We can qualify option C. D says not many native speakers were killed by European colonists. Again, if native speakers were not killed, then people who speak the language, they survive, then they would continue to speak the language will not die. So this is a likely reason for better survival rate, not the answer. The correct answer is option C. Next one. This is a bit of a challenging question. This is a weakening type question. Which one of the following hypothetical scenarios, if true, would most strongly undermine the central ideas of the passage? Undermine the central ideas, weaken the central ideas of the passage. A says, a liberal arts education requires that in addition to being fluent in English, students gain fluency in two of the top 5 most spoken languages globally. Now, this is definitely something that undermines the central idea. We remember that the second paragraph talked about a dominant language drowning out other languages. When one language became dominant, people would migrate to that language. They would forget, or they would drop out of the practice of speaking their own native language and thus forget their native language, forget their native culture. But one of the examples mentioned, the biggest language killers has been English, French, even Hindi was mentioned, Chinese. But that said, we see here, if liberal arts education requires that in addition to being fluent in English, which was in the passage defined as a language killer, students gain fluency. It is mandatory for students to gain fluency in 2 of the top 5 most spoken languages globally. Then we can correlate this to the second last paragraph, where students who were trained in a liberal art, who were trained in languages, who were taught languages, they would be able to understand different languages better, hence understand cultures better, hence their thought process, their mindset would become much more tolerant. So this is very much something that undermines the idea of English as a language killer and the dominant language necessarily killing other languages. A is a valid choice, we can qualify it. Schools that teach endangered languages can preserve the language only for a generation. This is not necessarily against the idea given in the passage. We had a mention of schools, particularly in the Navajo Inuit community, given in the last paragraph, where these schools have started to teach using their native language as a language of teaching, as a mode of teaching. In that, the number of these of the speakers of these languages has increased. But that said, we don't know if this practice would continue beyond one generation. So let's say at present, Inuit language, Navajo language, there's one more mention. These languages, the number of speakers for these languages increases. But if this practice is stopped, if these schools do not continue to the next generation, then again the same problem would happen. The demise would come in the next generation when again there would be no speakers of the language left. So this might or might not be true, does not necessarily undermine the idea given in the last paragraph. A very definitively does. It undermines the idea given in the second paragraph. So not B. Most liberal arts students will pursue jobs in publishing and human resource management rather than doctorates in linguistics. Agreed. Most students would not go to those lengths. When students are trained in language, they would become more tolerant towards other languages, other cultures, people from other cultures. But most liberal arts students would not go to such lengths. They would rather pursue jobs in publishing and human resource management rather than doctorates in language. Doctorates in language would be the scenario that will bring us close to the third last paragraph, where educators would go to far lengths to preserve languages. So this is also aligned with the information given in the passage. The second last and third last paragraphs. Not the answer. Recording a dying language that has only a few remaining speakers freezes it in time, stops evolving further. It freezes it in time. A dying language, if it is frozen in time, then it is preserved. The passage is not concerned with the evolution of languages. These languages are about to die. They're about to go extinct. We are not, the first primary concern is the preservation of these languages. Let us ensure that these languages survive. We will then talk about later, if at all we can, we'll talk about the evolution of these languages. So this is actually very much aligned with the passage. Recording a dying language might just preserve it. It freezes it in time, sure. So does not weaken the argument. The answer here is option A. Next question. So question 14 says, in the context of the passage, which one of the following hypothetical scenarios, if true, is not an example of a kind of loss that occurs when a language becomes extinct? Now, first off, this correlates with the third paragraph. We are talking about something that is lost, a kind of loss which occurs when a language becomes extinct. So when languages go extinct, what loss other than the language occurs? First off. Second, this is relating to hypothetical situations, hypothetical scenarios. We see Inuits of Alaska, Lamkangs of, so Inuits are mentioned, but not in the third paragraph. The Lamkangs of Manipur, the Nicobaris language, the Andamanese language, none of these are mentioned in the passage. This is an application-based question, pure inference. So in this, we have to see which example correlates to the kind of loss that is mentioned in the third paragraph. When a language is lost, some other things are lost. What loss that is? These are examples of that. We are looking for something that is not an example. So this is also an accept type question. We also remember from the third paragraph that what is lost when a language is lost? The people of the speakers of that language, they live in correlation with, in close proximity of their cultures. We see that here, the third paragraph. When we lose a language, we lose the worldview, culture, and knowledge of the people who spoke it, constituting a loss to all humanity. People around the world live in direct contact with their native environment, their habitat. When the language they speak goes extinct, the rest of humanity loses their knowledge of that environment, their wisdom about the relationship between local plants and illnesses, their philosophical religious beliefs, as well as their native cultural expression, music, visual art, poetry, etc., etc. All of that is lost. So in a simplification, when a language is lost, a part of that culture, things which are native to that culture, things which are native to their philosophy, their worldview, etc., those things are lost. So we are looking for something which does not give us that kind of a loss. Let's check with the options. The Inuits of Alaska have 35 different words to describe the texture of snow. When the language becomes extinct, we will lose that understanding of nature. Understanding of nature, an aspect of culture that would be lost when this language, the language of the Inuits of Alaska, is lost. This is very much an example of a loss of something which is environmental, which is correlated, which is related to the culture of the speakers of the language. So A is not a valid choice. B says the Lamkangs of Manipur have only 3 remaining native speakers of the language. When they die, we will lose one more group from the government list of indigenous tribes. This is a valid choice because we are not talking about the loss of the speakers of the language and hence the loss of the language itself. We are talking about the loss of something environmental, something cultural, lost along with the language. This only talks about the loss of the people, these Lamkangs of Manipur, only 3 remaining native speakers, surviving speakers. When they die, the group will be lost, but none of their worldview is talked about. Their culture is not talked about. Their perceptions, their worldview, their beliefs, their religious ideals, their culture, none of that is talked about. So this is not the kind of example that the passage was talking about, the third paragraph was talking about. This is a valid choice. We can be qualified. The Nicobarese language describes 20 different moods of the ocean. By the time the last speaker is educated in a central board school, again, if the last speaker is educated in a central board school, they would forget their language, the Nicobarese language, and thus they would forget the cultural correlations, the things of the Nicobarese culture that stem from the language. They will have forgotten their language. If they forget the language, these 20 different moods of the ocean, which is a local cultural aspect, a local cultural knowledge, that will be lost. Very much the kind of loss, something which is environmental, something which is cultural, additional to the loss of the language, that is being spoken about here. So C is not a valid choice. We can rule it out. The Andamanese language has a word to describe someone who has lost a stepsister. This language, a specific word to describe a certain loss, the loss of a stepsister. When the language dies, we will lose the concept of the word and the emotion it evokes. Again, the language dying, then this correlation of this loss of a specific relationship, it also dies. So something cultural, something relational dies when the language dies. Also an example of what the passage was talking about. We can rule it out. The correct answer is option B. One last question remaining. Question 15. It says here, the author believes that a liberal arts education combined with the participation in language preservation empowers students in all of the following ways, except that they will. Yet another except type question, quite a few this time around, this year around. But then we see that this is a reference to the second last paragraph. The second last paragraph says, when students get trained in languages, when they get educated in languages, they are able to emulate that language better. They are able to understand it better. They are able to incorporate the culture of those languages, speakers of those languages, into their own culture and cultural biases. They become more tolerant towards other cultures, people from other cultures, and their thought process evolves so that becomes multilinguistic, so that they become global citizens, where they think not just from the perspective, they think not just from the perspective of their own people, their own language, their own culture, but from a global perspective, which is a multilinguistic, multicultural, multifaceted outlook of the mind. We're looking for something that is not a part of this. We're looking for something where these students are empowered in ways except, so not a way in which the students would be empowered. Option A says, develop a better understanding of their own culture. Yes, they would better understand their own culture because they understand their own culture, they understand other cultures, and they can incorporate the other cultures into their own cultural biases. So not this. Establish schools to preserve languages spiraling towards extinction. Not likely. This is a valid choice because we see one, there's no mention of students. There's mention of students becoming more tolerant, more accepting of other languages and cultures, people from other cultures. But there's no mention of them establishing schools or taking action. Particularly, the first statement of the second last paragraph said, most students will not go to those lengths. The paragraph before that spoke of educators going to great lengths to preserve language. Even, for example, someone going to the Amazon to record a document, the language of a tribe where the last native speakers are about to die. So the language is about to go extinct. Here, schools also mentioned in the last paragraph as where the Navajo, the Inuit, etc., they have set up schools where they teach students, they educate students in their own language, and thus they try to preserve their language. We see that such actions is not something that is expected from students. Most students will not go to such lengths. First statement, second last paragraph, which means this is unlikely to be what students do. This is unlikely to be a way in which the students would be empowered when they're trying to preserve language. Learn different languages, directly relevant. Students who learn different languages, they are able to preserve languages, understand cultures better and preserve cultures. Not a valid choice. Overcome cultural barriers to communication. Again, cultural barriers to communication, very much relevant. If they are able to understand other languages, other cultures better, they'll be more tolerant towards them, they'll be more inclusive of them. So D is not a valid choice. The correct answer is option B. So we see that it is not, even if the passage is somewhat complicated, it's not extremely unlikely that we'll get all questions wrong. Perhaps doing this passage, attempting this passage, we might have had some lack of understanding from the last few paragraphs. Earlier, it's not that difficult to understand. Answering these questions, probably we would get the weakening one, the second one in this sequence, probably we'd get that one wrong. But the other questions, they're not very difficult. The options are manageable. The options are not as close. So we can actually get maybe 3 out of 4 correct in this one passage. Even if this is not the best selection, this would not be a bad selection. So it all depends upon how well we understand the passage, how well we are able to answer the questions. In any case, this concludes our discussion of the RCs. Hence, next up, let's talk about the questions, the topics from the VA. Here we go. Right. So now that we are done with the RC part of things, let's move on to the VA. Let us begin with jumble sentence 4-liners, that one most annoying topic that most students find very challenging. There is a benefit to jumbles though. Both the jumbles topics, they are TETA questions in the CAT. So at the very least, they don't have a penalty marking for wrong answers. They don't have negative marking, one could say. So we should answer these questions, technically speaking, because they cannot hurt us, but they can cost us time. We should go about them fast. One should not think too much on these questions. Let us discuss a few. Let's start with a moderate question. We see that these are all 4-liners. CAT only features 4-liner questions, 4-liner jumbles, and the other format that the CAT features is odd statement. We'll talk about that later. So this question says, the first statement says, contemporary African writing like The Bottled Leopard voices this theme using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose 2 varying cultures. Let's see what that corrects with. Chupumeka Ike explores the conflict and casts the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping and unaccommodating towards local African practice. So far, we don't have much of a connection, but we might have this theme connecting with the conflict mentioned here. We'll confirm on that. However, their views contradict the reality for a rich and sustaining local African cultural ethos exists for all who care to see and experience. We still don't have much of a connection. We do see that their views contradict the reality. There must be referring to someone. We might be talking about African, but then it says here their views contradict the reality for a rich and sustaining local African culture. So Africans are wrong about their own culture. Their opinion on their own culture is incorrect. Sounds unlikely. Exists for all who care to see and experience. After that, so we might have this sentence and then we might have this sentence. Let's see about that. Finally, the fourth statement says Western Christian concepts tend to deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. Now, this we can see clearly connects with their here. Their views contradict the reality because they deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. However, their views contradict the reality, for a rich and sustaining local African cultural ethos exists for all who care to see and experience, even if they deny that such a cultural ethos exists, even if they feign ignorance. They say that we don't know about it. But anyone who wishes to find out, wishes to read about it, for them it does exist. So clearly, 3 and 4 are connected. Let us begin with that. We have 4 first, and then 3. So 4 telling us about Western Christian concepts, and then their view, referring to Christianity, Western Christian concepts, contradict the reality because such a rich African cultural ethos, it exists for all who care to see and experience. So first off, we have one pair in 4-3. We've put that in the box where we would have the answer. Next up, we realize that 2 and 1 are connected because no other statement talks about the cultural ethos. We see here, Chukwuemeka Ike must be an author, explores the conflict and casts the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping, and unaccommodating towards local African practice. We see here contemporary African writing like The Bottle Leopard voices this theme referring to something. This theme is either talking about the local African cultural ethos. If that be connected, then we don't have a place to put in 2. Or it can connect with this theme, the aspect of the conflict between the African ethos and the Western perspective. So contemporary African writing like The Bottle Leopard voices this theme using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose 2 varying cultures. This phrase, 2 varying cultures, clearly talks about the conflict between 2 cultures, the Western culture and the local African practice. So clearly, we have another pair of sentences here where we have statement 2 first, and then we have statement 1. So we have 4-3 and 2-1. Here we realize that it is 4 which introduces the idea of Western Christian concept and indigenous African tradition, then African cultural ethos that is introduced in 4 and 3. So the pair 4-3 comes first, 2-1 comes after. Also, because we know that one of the core methodologies with which we can approach jumbles, 4-liners, placing or sequencing them is the general to specific rule. Statements go from more general to more specific. By that, we see that 4-3 are more generalized versus 2 takes a specific example of one, an author, then second, a work, The Bottle Leopard, and then explains this conflict in this context. So we find that clearly 2-1 must come after 4-3, which means that we have our sequence. The correct answer to this question is 4-3-2-1. Now, let us look at another question, a bit more challenging. So if the previous one was a medium question, this is a medium to tough question. Let's see. Statement 1 says, what precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? It might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. We see that this talks about what unusual elements make a particular case so attractive. It might be particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Might give us the answer, but we are not sure about that. We have to tally with the other statements. Let's hold off. 3 says, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder doesn't. Now, this we see does connect with the previous statement. We have, it might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often, it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Mystery then exemplified, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder doesn't. So we realize that there is a pair between 2 and 3. As of right now, we cannot quite decide which order. Is it 2-3 or 3-2? Let us write both down. could be 2-3 or 3-2. Finally, 4 says, why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into permanent obscurity? Now we get one hint that this might come, 4 might pair with 1 because both are questions. If we look at that, then we find that the answer might be given by this pair 2 and 3. So if we consider that, then why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination, others locked into permanent obscurity? Again, by the general to specific rule, this comes first because this talks about some crimes being re-examined while others being locked into permanent obscurity. What precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? Also, this introduces the idea of audience, which is not present here. So we begin to form an idea that we first have the statements 4-1 in sequence, 4-1 in that order. Let's clear all of this out. Now we can consider 2 and 3 and form the pair. We see here 2 says it might be a particularly savage and unfathomable level of depravity. We see that this now begins to answer the question we are asking here. What are the unusual elements? Might be a particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something, the mystery that we are talking about here, something that ordinary murder doesn't. So we realize that it is 2-3 in the order 2-3 because in 2 we have one thing, might be. So in might be it is trying to answer the question what precisely are the unusual elements. Might be particularly savage or unfathomable level of depravity, but very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Mystery then finds an example in unsolved and unsolvable cases. So we realize first off that it is 2-3, not 3-2. This is the order. And then it is 4 which introduces the idea of what makes some cases be re-examined, other cases locked into obscurity. What are the unusual elements that causes this particular selection of cases? And then we see more examples. Yet again, by general to specific, we realize 4-1 comes first. So we get 4-1 as the opening pair and then 2-3 as the closing pair. If we clear everything else out, we realize that our answer in this case is 4-1-2-3. Now let us look at an even more difficult question. So this would be, the first question that we dealt with was medium. The second one was medium to tough. This one is a tough question. Yet again, not because of the length necessarily, but because of the potential misconception between connections. We have this as from CAT 2023, Shift 2. We are taking only CAT 2023 questions for the 4-liners because surprisingly, CAT 2024 did not feature 4-liners. But in any case, always likely to make a comeback. Here, statement 1 says, algorithms hosted on the internet are accessed by many. So biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact, adversely affecting far larger group of people. Though algorithmic bias is the popular term, the foundation of such bias. Now we have such bias, might be talking about biases in AI, particularly because we are referring to algorithmic bias, but we are not sure of that. We'll confirm. The foundation of such bias is not in algorithm, but in the data. Algorithms are not biased. Data is as algorithm merely reflects personal patterns that are present in the training data. So it is possible that 1 and 2 have a connection. 3 says, despite their widespread impact, it is relatively easier to fix AI biases than human-generated biases, as it is simple to identify the former than to try to make people unlearn behavior learned over generations. Now, this has a slightly different connotation. We're talking about AI biases here, but also human biases or human-generated biases. We see there is a connection between this and statement 4. The impact of biased decisions made by humans or human-generated biases is localized and geographically confined. But with the advent of AI, the impact of such decisions is spread over a much wider scale, which suggests that we introduce biased decisions made by humans here in 4 And then we talk about this in human-generated biases, perhaps compare this with AI biases, but we are already on the topic of fixing this. So if we place the sequence as 4, 3, then the sequence ends there. We don't have a place for 1 and 2. 4 introduces these ideas. 3 concludes by talking about how to fix these problems. That will not work. But we know that 4 and 3 would be in sequence because 4 introduces this idea and 3 sort of concludes it. So let us write 4 here and 3 here. We seem to have the other statements in between. Let's check. If that be the case, the impact of biased decisions made by humans is localized and geographically confined. But with the advent of AI, the impact of such decisions is spread over a much wider scale. Now, this does bode very well for us because we realize this talks about biased decisions made by humans, talks about AI, doesn't talk about AI bias. Bias in AI is then introduced in statement 1 here. Algorithms hosted on the internet are accessed by many. So biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact, adversely affecting far larger groups of people. Though algorithmic bias is the popular term, the foundation of such bias. Now, we see that both these statements, they talk about bias. So which one would connect with, and they talk about AI bias, which one would connect with statement 4? 4, we seem to understand that is the opening statement, the first statement. Which one would connect with this? Such bias cannot connect with 4. That is not possible because 4 does not talk about bias in the case of algorithms or AI. It seems likely because we have algorithmic bias in quotations here. So it seems as if 2 introduces the idea of bias in AI, but actually it is 1 that introduces bias in AI. This connection does not pan out. The term such bias actually talks about this bias introduced. So biases in AI introduced in statement 1. That means after all of this, we can conclude that statement 1 and 2 do have a pair. They form a pair. So 1 comes first because 1 introduces bias. And then we have 2, which talks about such bias. We realize now that 4 being the opening statement where human bias, bias decisions is introduced, and then we talk about AI, then goes through 1, 2, the pair 1, 2, and then it comes to 3 as the conclusion. So 4 talks about human biases and then talks about AI. 1 introduces the idea of bias into AI, into the context of AI. 2 then further talks about AI bias, talking about such bias and introducing the term algorithmic bias. And then 3 talks about, 3 sort of changes the argument by saying there are relatively easier ways to fix AI bias than human-generated bias. That is clearly the conclusion. So we realize that we first have statement 4, then the pair 1 and 2, then 3. So 4 coming first, then the pair 1 and 2, and finally we have 3. So the correct answer is 4, 1, 2, 3. So that said, we realize that 4-liners can be a bit of a scramble. They can be a bit difficult to answer, but with some presence of mind, they can be done. That's not a potential problem. Also, if we get them wrong, there is no penalty for it. So we should ideally do them, but do them fast so that the one thing that they can cost us, time, that is not wasted. Time, after all, is a very precious resource in an exam, in a competitive exam such as the CAT. So that should give us some clarity on how to answer or how to attempt 4-liners. Now let us talk about the other topics from the VA section, VA subsection. Let's see. Segue into the para-completion questions. Para-completion, as the industry largely is calling it, or statement positioning as I call it, because this is where you have to position a statement, a sentence, is this format of questions. To note, we have a sentence given here, then a paragraph. The sentence will fit in one of these numbered blanks, the 1, 2, 3, or 4. Corresponding to these, we have these options, which talk about option 1, option 2, which represents blank 1, blank 2, and so on. This is a new type of question which has been introduced in the CAT in the year 2022, inspired by a very similar kind of similar format of question from the IELTS. In any case, let's look at the options here, or let's look at the question here. We have three questions to discuss. This is the first one. Take note that we have these options jumbled up. What I mean to say here is that in option 1, option A, we have blank 2 referred to as option 2. We have 3 in B, 4 in C, 1 in D. So these are jumbled up. The first year when this featured, it was not so. It was option 1, 2, 3, 4. Since then, they've been jumbling these. So we should be cautious about which blank we are talking about, accordingly, which option would be the answer. But remember, all of these, the words option, they refer to blank. So if blank 1 were to be the answer, we would select option D as the answer, which says option 1 refers to blank 1. With that understood, we see here the first question. This is from CAT 2024, the first shift, the morning shift. The sentence tells us, comprehending a wide range of emotions, Renaissance music, nevertheless, portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. Here, from the sentence, we have three key arguments, or three key ideas given to us. First off, the subject Renaissance, that is what we are talking about, particularly music in the Renaissance or from the Renaissance. We also see the ideas given here about the Renaissance or about Renaissance music, comprehending a wide range of emotions. Renaissance music portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. The third aspect is this change of argument word, nevertheless. Nevertheless suggests that this sentence would follow another sentence which is stating something opposite to what this statement is saying, because the change of argument would bring the argument to some other place. By the looks of it, we would have nevertheless following a statement where this comes back to an original argument. Let's see about that. The paragraph reads, a volume of translated Italian madrigals were published in London during the year of 1588. This sudden public interest facilitated a surge of English madrigal writing, as well as a spurt of other secular music writing and publication. Then we have the first blank. Now let us understand. We don't probably know what the word madrigal means because it has been mentioned here as translated Italian madrigals. We realize that this must be an Italian word. It is in the context of music that we understand what exactly this is. It is saying that a volume of translated madrigals were published, were written, etc., etc. Madrigal writing became a thing during the period, which means this must be some sort of a song lyric. So what kind, whether it is song or whether it is music, we don't know, but it refers to music. Let's see about that. With that understood, we can move on. We don't need to understand, or we don't need to know exactly what the word madrigal means. So we see that the first two blanks here can be eliminated. Why? Because the given sentence is general. It talks about Renaissance music, but it doesn't talk about the context. It doesn't talk about which kind of Renaissance music. We have this clear idea of English Renaissance music, English madrigals, and also the Italian madrigals running through the first few statements, about three to four statements. It is after the blank 2, and it is after, in fact, close to blank 3, when we come to the general premise of Renaissance music. This here is where we talk about Renaissance music, just Renaissance music, not Italian or British Renaissance music or Italian or British madrigals. We talk about Renaissance music in general over here, just the statement before blank 3. So reading from the beginning, we realize that 1 and 2 can be eliminated. A volume of translated Italian madrigals were published in London during the year of 1588. This sudden public interest facilitated a surge of English madrigal writing, as well as spurt of other secular music writing and publication. Then the first blank. This music boom lasted for 30 years and was as much a golden age of music as British literature was with Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth I. We see that this does not connect because, yes, this is in the context of music, but in specific, the sentence is talking about emotions, a range of emotions. This is talking about the actual writing of these madrigals. So blank 1 is not a valid choice. We can rule out option D. Then we have, after this sentence, we have blank 2, the second blank. The statement after that says, the rebirth in both literature and music originated in Italy, migrated to England. The English madrigal became more humorous and lighter in England as compared to Italy. Yet again, we see that all of this is first connected with the idea given in the statements before this. It is still talking about the madrigal. Also, there's still this context of English madrigal and Italy and Italian madrigal, Italian writing, the Renaissance migrating from Italy to England. So we see here that the given sentence, first off, with the general subject. Second off, talking about emotions does not fit in blank 2. The statements after blank 2, they're still talking about the same old thing as the statements before blank 2. So blank 2 is also eliminated. We can rule out option A. Next up, we see just before blank 3 now, we have one statement which refers to Renaissance music. Renaissance music was mostly polyphonic in nature. Once again, we probably don't know what polyphonic means, but we can sort of understand it. We can sort of divine its meaning via word roots. So phone, P-H-O-N, a part of the word P-H-O-N-E, phone refers to sound. Telephones, telephone is the word tele, from far away, phone, sound from a far away, telephone. So phone here refers to sound. Phonic is referred to pronunciation of sounds or production of sounds. Poly is something which refers to multiple. Mono, being the opposite, refers to singular. So a very common, though kind of stupid example, but a very common example is polygamy versus monogamy. Marriage to multiple people is polygamy. Marriage to one person or being loyal in marriage to one person is monogamy. A person who remains married to one person is called monogamous. So polyphonic means having multiple types of sounds. Here, not only do we introduce the idea of Renaissance music in general, but also we introduce the polyphonic nature of it, which can then correlate with comprehending a wide range of emotions. Remember, poly, multiple, wide range of emotions. Renaissance music nevertheless portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. Here, we'll run into a problem. We'll realize that broadly speaking and generally speaking, at first glance, the given sentence may fit in blank 3 or fit in blank 4, because even before blank 4 and after blank 4, we still have the idea of Renaissance. The statement after blank 4 is still talking about Renaissance music. So here we get confused. 1 and 2, easy to eliminate. Blanks 3 and 4, what do we do about this? Here, we will realize that it is this word, the nevertheless, the change of argument word, which comes to our help. If we look at the sentence after blank 3, let's clear some of this out. If you look at the sentence after blank 3, it says, extreme use of and contrasts in dynamics, rhythm, and tone color do not occur. This says that basically, in essence, Renaissance music portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. So what is mentioned here, Renaissance music portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. That is also present here. Extreme use of contrast in dynamics, rhythm, and tone color do not occur. But if we place this in this blank, the nevertheless makes sense. Before that, we see it was polyphonic in nature. It was polyphonic in nature. It had a wide range of emotions. Nevertheless, it portrayed all the emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. Extreme uses of contrast in dynamic contrast, difference in dynamics, rhythm, tone, color do not occur because Renaissance music portrayed these emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. So the nevertheless connects the previous statement to this blank and then to the next statement. If we place this in the blank, in blank 4, with the statement after blank 4, we will have a conflict because once again, we have a word which is a change of argument. Nevertheless, over here, the statement after blank 4 says, the rhythms in Renaissance music tend to have a smooth, soft flow instead of a sharp, well-defined pulse of accents. The statement before that says, extreme use of contrast in dynamics, rhythm, and tone color do not occur. After this, then we see Renaissance music portrayed all emotions in a balanced and moderate fashion. which is the same as the statement before, blank 4. But then we have the nevertheless. The nevertheless means that there is a change of argument here. A change of argument here fits perfectly. A change of argument here cannot, because the statement before is talking about the same thing, which means by that logic, just placing the change of argument, we can qualify blank 3 and eliminate blank 4, which means now in the given options, from the given options, we can rule out option 4 or option C rather, which talks about blank 4, and we can qualify option B. The correct answer is option B. The given sentence will fit in blank number 3. This was a medium question. Let us move on to another medium question, but something with a very common twist in these questions. Once this twist is understood, we can solve quite a few questions just by using that one strategy. Let's see. This question is from the second shift, the afternoon shift of CAT 2024. The sentence here says, science has officially crowned us superior to our early rising brethren. Now, we will see on reading the passage, you can pause the video and read the passage. We would see that it has to fit in blank number 2, because there is a possibility that might fit in some other blanks. We'll be able to eliminate 1 easily, 3 easily. We'll discuss this in a moment. But then we might have this in blank 4 as well, because the sentence says, science has officially crowned us superior to our early rising brethren. Evidence given by research led by academics at Imperial College London studied data on more than 26,000 people and found that self-declared night owls generally tend to have higher cognitive scores. So we realize that this gives us some evidence of science proving this point right, that night owls, people who are late sleepers, late risers, they might actually be better off, they might actually be healthier. But we would realize if we place the given sentence in blank 4, there is a blank or there is a logical gap that remains in blank 2. Let's see about that. This is a very interesting passage, very funny, in fact, very sarcastic, so to speak. My fellow night owls, grab a strong cup of coffee and gather round. I have great news. So not only does the author place himself or herself in the same shoes as his or her readers, night owls immediately has a sense of connection. Grab a strong cup of coffee, because these are people who sleep late at night, wake up late in the morning, and so they would be drowsy the rest of the day. Their circadian cycle is not the best, so they'd always be looking for a strong cup of coffee. So grab a strong cup of coffee and gather around. I have great news. Then we have the first blank. For a long time, our kind has been unfairly maligned. Our kind as in night owls, those who are late to sleep, late to rise, stereotyped as lazy and undisciplined. So we see here, for a long time, our kind has been unfairly maligned. We are talking about night owls here. We cannot then change the argument to early rising brethren. Science has officially crowned us superior to our early rising brethren. We first off need to introduce the idea of the late rising of night owls. Then we talk about science, etc., etc. So science at this point would not pan out, because the statements after this, they do not give us anything about science. So it is not going to fit. The sentence is not going to fit in blank 1. Now, if you look at blank 2, this is where we see that there is a logical gap. Let's see about that. Let's talk about that. Told we ought to be morning larks, advised to go to bed early so we can wake before 5 a.m. and run a marathon before breakfast, like all high flyers seem to do. Now, however, we are having the last laugh. We see here, we are having the last laugh. Who? Night owls, late sleepers, late risers, those who do not sleep early, do not get up early, do not run the marathon, etc., etc. Then we have blank 2. It may be a tad more complicated than that. Now we see here, we are having the last laugh is immediately followed by a statement. It may be a tad more complicated than that. We did not introduce why we would have the last laugh. If we just introduce, or if we just hint at having the last laugh, having a victory, not say what the victory is, and then change the argument by saying it may be a tad more complicated than that, we clearly have something missing in between. We can place the given sentence in any other blank. there would still be a logical gap here, which has to be filled, has to it can only be filled by the given sentence. If you look at the following statements, three can be eliminated. It may be a tad more complicated than that. A study published last week, which you may have already seen while scrolling at 1 a.m. See, so funny, interesting. A study published last week. This is what authors often do. They talk about studies, they quote studies or scientists, etc., experts, etc., etc., to validate their points. But this says a study published last week, which you may have already seen while scrolling at 1 a.m. because these are night owls. What are they doing? They're up at night, maybe in their beds, doom scrolling on their screen, reading feeds. So you might have seen this scrolling at 1 a.m. Suggests that staying up late could be good for brain power. Then we have blank three. Is this study a thinly veiled PR exercise conducted by a caffeine pill company? Nope, it's legit. So we see that three statements before and after they connect. There's no reason for us to shove a statement about science crowning us superior in between. We are talking about a study here, and we are continuing with that idea of the study here. So again, not three. So we have eliminated blanks one, which means option C is out, and blank three, which means option A is out. Two is what we are looking for. Two seems to be the answer. Four can also be, because we've seen that right after four, we have research led by academics at. So this could very well follow an argument about science. But if we do that, as we have already discussed, we would have a logical gap here. Now, however, we are having the last laugh. Also, now and however, these change the argument from before. So the earlier notion, the common notion is that people keep telling us we should be early morning larks instead of night owls. We should wake up early, go to bed early, wake up before 5, run a marathon before breakfast, like all high flyers seem to do. Now, however, we are having the last laugh. We don't introduce why we are having the last laugh, then immediately change the argument, pivot again, and say it may be a tad more complicated than that. Doesn't make sense. So, with just this, we understand that the given sentence has to fit in blank number 2. Once we do that, we can justify blank number 4. There is nothing in blank number 4. The statements before and after can very well be connected. What is this last statement? The idea about research led by academics at Imperial College London talking about? This is giving evidence to support the statement made here. Nope, it is legit. It is legitimate. Is this study a thinly veiled PR exercise conducted by a caffeine pill company? Nope, it is legit. Research led by academics at Imperial College London studied data on more than 26,000 people and found that self-declared night owls generally tend to have higher cognitive scores. This means that we have to qualify blank 2, which is an option B, and by comparison then, obviously, we can rule out blank 4, which means option D is out. The correct answer here is option B, which is blank 2. Now, this was also medium. It was made medium. It could be very confusing if we didn't know this idea of filling a logical gap in the passage. This one thing can actually help us answer a lot of questions. Once we understand this idea, this question becomes easy, not very difficult. It's a medium level question. We see another question, let's say a harder question, where the same idea will help us. We need to fill a logical gap here. Let's see what this says. The sentence says, the Europeans did not invent globalization. We see that the passage is talking about globalization, but we realize that this can actually fit at a lot of positions. It can fit, we can eliminate 1 and 2 easily, but both 3 and 4 are potential choices. Let's read the paragraph and do what we can. Let's eliminate 1 and 2. The first phase of globalization occurred long before the introduction of either steam or electric power. Chinese consumers at all social levels consumed vast quantities of spices, fragrant woods, and unusual plants. The peoples of Southeast Asia who lived in forests gave up their traditional livelihoods and completely reoriented their economies to supply Chinese consumers. Then we have the first blank. These exchanges of the year 1000 opened some of the routes through which goods and peoples continued to travel after Columbus traversed the mid-Atlantic. Now we see here that there is a reference here. There's a pronoun which makes a reference, which is these exchanges. If we look at the given sentence, we try to fit the given sentence in blank one. It talks about the Europeans did not invent globalization. So Europeans, globalization, nothing which can be referred to as exchanges, which means clearly that the sentence cannot fit in blank one. So we can rule out option D. Next up, we see that 2 is also easy to eliminate. These exchanges of the year 1000 open some of the routes through which goods and peoples continued to travel after Columbus traversed the mid-Atlantic. Then we have blank 2. Yet the world of 1000 differed from that of 1492 in important ways. The travelers who encountered one another in the year 1000 were much closer technologically. Here again, we see the world of 1000, yet the world of 1000 differed from that of 1492. We introduced 1000, the year 1000, or the peoples of 1000 here, and then we talk about this, where we show a difference from the world of 1000. The given statement, Europeans, globalization, does not fit in between. Statements before and after blank 2 interconnected to each other by the subject, the world of 1000. So clearly, the given sentence would not fit here. Blank 2 can also be eliminated, which means option C is knocked off the board. Then we see that 3 and 4 are both potentials. Yet the world of 1000 differed from that of 1492 in important ways. The travelers who encountered one another in the year 1000 were much closer technologically than blank 3. They changed and augmented what was already there since 1000. Then blank 4. If globalization hadn't yet begun, Europeans wouldn't have been able to penetrate the markets in so many places as quickly as they did after 1492. This is a quintessential cat deceptive question. You might look at it and you think, obviously, the answer is 4, right? Because the statement is talking about the Europeans, globalization. The statement after that is talking about globalization. It is also talking about Europeans. So obviously blank 4. The statement before that is talking about 1000. The statement before that is talking about 1000. Obviously not 3. So it has to be 4, right? Incorrect. The answer here is blank 3. Why so? Let's look at it. This is again drawing upon the same logic that we discussed in the previous question. If you place the given sentence in blank 4, there is a gap left in blank 3. Look at the statements before and after blank 3. We have that here. Yet the world of 1000, talking about the world of 1000, differed from that of 1492 in important ways. The travelers, we see that the statement after blank 3 begins with they. They could very well be connected with travelers. No problems there. But if travelers is what they is referring to, then the subject here and the subject here are both the same. So they have the same subject. They must be talking about the same people. The travelers who encountered one another in the year 1000 were much closer technologically. Then we say they changed. They changed and augmented. Quite possible. What was already there since 1000? So people in 1000, in the year 1000, were changing, augmenting what already existed from 1000. How is the present and the past the same year? That's impossible. Now, this is much more difficult to understand than the previous question, but once you understand it, once you see it, you realize that we have a gap in blank 3, which can perfectly be filled by the given sentence. Why? Because the given sentence has the subject, the Europeans. The Europeans fitting here changes this subject, they, to refer to the Europeans instead of the travelers. The Europeans did not invent globalization. They changed and augmented what was already there since 1000. Remember, once you place this, you would be able to see there's another subject, small, minor subject change that we have missed out. If we place the given sentence here, it pans out very well. We have the Europeans placed here. That said, the world of 1000 differed from that of 1492. The Europeans must belong to 1492. The travelers who encountered one another in the year 1000 were much closer technologically. The Europeans did not invent globalization. The Europeans of 1492, they changed and augmented what was already there since 1000. So once we see this, we see that now the phrase since 1000 makes much more sense, which means we cannot place the given sentence in blank 4. In fact, in blank 4, we'll realize there's a bit of a of an awkward step off in the statement after that as well. The sentence here says the Europeans did not invent globalization. The very next statement says if globalization hadn't yet begun, Europeans wouldn't have been able to penetrate the markets in so many places. So there is not much of a direct connection. It's a bit abrupt going here. Europeans did not invent globalization. What they did must be mentioned. If globalization hadn't yet begun, Europeans wouldn't have been able to penetrate the markets in so many ways. This may be allowed. This is possible. Depends on the context. But clearly, we cannot have a gap in blank 3. So blank 3 has to be filled by the subject, the Europeans, from the given sentence, which means that the given sentence has to fit in blank 3. We can rule out option B. The correct answer is option A. Here, let us note that knowledge of some terms, some vocabulary, maybe a little bit of the past or certain things, terms of literature, one could say, they can help. We had the first question as something relating to Renaissance music. We see here, Renaissance, there is in fact a term given somewhere, rebirth. We have the word rebirth here. Renaissance is an Italian term which actually means rebirth. A little bit of understanding of, say, the vocabulary of such words, or maybe a little bit of the history of such words, is not vital. The question can be solved, but one can understand the context better with those words, with knowledge of the background, the etymology, the history, the meaning, the vocabulary, the diction of these words. Renaissance is an Italian word which means rebirth. We see rebirth used here. Renaissance came to be first in Italian painting, then music, etc., etc. And then it percolated because a lot of British art, music, painting, sculpting, etc., etc., was copied from Italy. And so when the Italians, they emulated, or rather when the British, they emulated Italian art, they also emulated Renaissance. Renaissance meant a rebirth. Now, more of that context can be learned via Google. But what I'm saying here is that if we know this word, then at the very least, it does not feel jarring. We don't feel like there is this word Renaissance. I've heard it so many times, but I don't know what it means. So I'm kind of lost with this. It keeps on distracting me. That does not happen. Other than that, there are some clear logical points. Understanding them, we can easily solve these questions, would not be a problem at all. The first two questions were medium. I would term the third question as hard, because it's not that there is a hard question means that a question is hard means that it has to have very dense language. What it means is that there would be a higher chance of you making a mistake with it. It's quite possible that most people would answer blank 4, select blank 4 for the third question that we did. This one. The one about Europeans and globalization. It's quite possible that one might select blank 4, but that would be incorrect. Once we understand that there is a logical gap in blank 3, we can easily answer this question. Then it becomes a medium-ish question, medium-like question. In any case, let's talk about the other topics going on now. So with that done, let us take a look at summary questions. Again, we have 3 questions here. Summary questions, they come with the passage, and then the options. 4 options, obviously, to every question of CAT, barring the TETA questions. Between these, there is one option which is the best summary, the most appropriate summary that we have to select. It is important to note that the key methodology, the key approach to summary is not qualification, but rather elimination. One cannot always tell that a given answer is the correct answer, but one can easily tell whether a given option is a wrong choice based on distortions, limitations, differences in perspective. One could eliminate answer choices, and thus what remains would become the most appropriate summary. So let's look at this passage. This one, the first question that we are dealing with here, this is from CAT 2024, the second shift, the afternoon shift. This passage, again, feel free to pause the video to read the passage and the options to answer the question if you would like, and then tally with me. We see here, the passage talks about important findings because of collaboration between physicists and other fields. We see here, Recent important scientific findings have emerged from crossing boundaries of scientific fields. This is from the perspective of physicists. They stem from physicists collaborating with people from other fields, biologists, sociologists, etc., to answer questions. But physicists and their potential collaborations often find their cultures out of sync. Next up, this paragraph, this passage talks about certain problems, certain hindrances, hurdles to this collaboration between physicists and other fields. Two reasons are given primarily. For one, physicists often discard a lot of information while extracting broad patterns. For other scientists, information is not readily disposed. Further, the second reason is this one. This is number one, and this is where we have number two. Many non-physicists are uncomfortable with mathematical models. Still, here we have a conclusion. It moves on from the hurdles, the hindrances. It says, still the desire to work on something new and different is real, and there are clear benefits from the collision of views. So there are clear benefits from the collision of views. That said, let us look at the options. A says, despite differences in their research styles, physicists' research collaborations with scholars from other disciplines have yielded important research findings. This is quite valid. This is quite comprehensive, covers a lot of ground. If we tally between points, despite differences, we see there are differences, their cultures being out of sync. That has been mentioned. The reasons are not given. Discarding of information and then non-physicists being uncomfortable with mathematical models. That is not given, but we may leave out that deeper explanation in a summary. We see differences mentioned. So this idea is mentioned. The explanations would be subsumed in that. And then physicists, that's the primary subject that we see here. Research, physicists' research collaborations. Collaborations, another important aspect. Collaborations is the idea that is being talked about here, collaboration between the given subjects. With scholars from other disciplines, other disciplines also mentioned, have yielded important research findings. This is a tally with the first statement of the passage. So we find that A is a rather valid choice, covers a lot of ground from the passage. We can qualify this. Let's not do that just yet. Let's see if there's another option which is more inclusive. Option B says, physicists have successfully buried their differences on research methods applied in other fields in their desire to find answers to baffling scientific questions. There is a lot of distortion here. We see, first off, the subject physicist is there, but then physicists have successfully buried their differences on research methods. They have not buried their differences. We see at the end also the passage tells us there are clear benefits from the collision of views. That means that differences are not buried at all. The differences exist. These physicists, they find collaboration with other fields or experts from other fields difficult because they often find their cultures out of sync. So physicists have successfully buried their differences is incorrect. It's a distortion. The passage does not tell us that. That's a baseless assumption. The passage does not tell us that. On research methods applied in other fields. Now, this is not necessarily research methods applied in other fields. We don't know where exactly these research methods have been applied. The passage only says important scientific findings. Could very well be in the field of physics as well. So another distortion here. And then in their desire to find answers to baffling scientific questions, where are members of experts of the other fields, collaboration with biologists, sociologists, and others mentioned? We do not have any of that. So not only is this option distorted, it is also limited. It omits certain premises from the passage. So clearly, the answer is not B. Option C tells us large data sets and mathematical models in physics. This refers to the problems, the hurdles, why physicists find the cultures of their field versus that of others out of sync. One, because physicists often discard a lot of information, large data sets. And the second is non-physicists are uncomfortable with mathematical models in physics research. So large data sets and mathematical models in physics research combined with research methods of non-physicist collaborators have yielded important scientific findings. Again, this is a bit more inclusive than option B because it does talk about non-physicist collaborators. Physicists are also mentioned, subsumed in physics. But that said, this distorts by saying that not just the collaboration with other fields, but also large data sets and mathematical models have yielded important scientific findings. Collaborations The collaboration between physicists and other people from other fields, that has yielded important scientific findings, but these remain the problem, these remain hurdles in that collaboration. So this is clearly incorrect. This is quite distorted. While this covers good ground, solid ground from the passage, it is more inclusive than option B. It still has distortion in it. C is not the answer. D says the desire to diversify their research and answer important questions has led to several collaborations between physicists and other social scientists. Now, we see that this says physicists and other social scientists. This takes sociology specifically. There's no reason to do that. One could drop this and say scientists from these other fields. First problem. The second problem is that this does not have any distortions, but it is quite limited because the desire to diversify their research and answer important questions has led to several collaborations. But what is the outcome? The outcome is important scientific findings that mentioned in the first option that has been omitted here. So we could parallel compare when in doubt with summary questions. When there are close options, always compare them between each other. Check out the premises included in an option. We see that D misses out at least one when A doesn't. So D is clearly not the answer. The answer is option A. Let us look at another moderate level question. This one is from 2024 shift 1, the morning shift. This talks about cartographers and map making. Cartographers are map makers, those who make maps. Cartographers design and create maps to communicate information about phenomena located somewhere on our planet. In the past, cartographers did not worry too much about who was going to read their maps. Although some simple usability research was done, like comparing whether circle or bar symbols work best, cartographers knew how to make maps. This passage talks about a change, a social change that has happened in cartography. In cartography, earlier, cartographers were confident about their craft. They had very minor decisions to make, particularly, say, for example, this one, whether circle or bar symbols work best. They didn't much think about the usability. Usability is an important aspect, the usability of their maps. This has changed now, however, due to all kinds of societal and technological developments. Today's map readers are more demanding, mostly because of the tools they use to read maps. So map readers these days are demanding because of the tools they use to read maps. There are societal and technological developments. Cartographers who are also influenced by these trends are now more interested in seeing if their products are efficient, effective, and appreciated. So we find here that cartographers are also driven by these changes, by these technological and societal developments, such that they think about the actual usability of their maps, also because the map readers have become much more demanding. They demand that the maps are much more usable as compared to what earlier was the scenario. So let us look at the options. A says today, cartographers also need to look into the usability of maps because of the new technological developments. Now, this is good but slightly limited. One, because it only says technological, it omits societal. Socio-technological could have been said, but doesn't say that. So it only says technological developments. Second is, it only presents the argument from today. It does not talk about the past. What we start here in the past, that has not been mentioned. Now, agreed, the past is sort of subsumed here because we say that in the present something has changed. What we mean is there has been a change from the past. But let us see if we have an option which manages to fix these problems, which addresses this limitation, which has mention of the past. Just mention would do. That would still fix the problem. And mention of societal and technological developments. So A may be the answer if we find nothing better. B says maps are being used for a variety of reasons and therefore map readers have become more demanding, quite limited, further limited as compared to option A. First off, we see that it says here maps are being used for a variety of reasons. The passage does not tell us that. Map readers have become more demanding because of societal and technological developments. That is why map makers, cartographers, are paying more attention to the usability. Maps are being used for a variety of reasons. The passage does not tell us, so we cannot draw this conclusion. Possible, likely in real life, but we don't need that. And therefore, map readers have become more demanding. Map readers have become more demanding. This also omits the major premise, the major subject of cartographers. So clearly, this is not the answer. Compared to A, B is further limited. Also, there is a baseless assumption in B. This is summary. We don't have any place for baseless assumptions. We don't have any place for inferences. So B is knocked off the board. C tells us modern map makers evaluate a map's effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. Agreed. We see that here. Of the users through a series of experiments. But what is the change? What has happened? What developments have happened? Why have map readers become more demanding? None of that is mentioned in this option. Compared to that, while this entire explanation of what change has happened was not given, we do see that there is a change. And the primary aspect is usability. So we find that again, C is not as good a choice as option A. Option A is inferior, but C is further inferior, even more inferior. So not C. C is knocked off the board. New technological developments, same problem, technological, does not say societal, have prompted cartographers to experiment with their maps by applying these new innovations. Again, full of distortions. We see here, first off, technological does not fix the problem that we had here. The past also has not been mentioned here. It is only that there is a change. So from the change, we have to infer the past. The past is subsumed in the argument of change. At the very least, A said today. So there is something relevant to the present that has been mentioned. In this, we see new technological developments have prompted cartographers to experiment with their maps. One could say that that is true. Cartographers are paying more attention. We see that they're influenced by these trends and are interested in seeing if their products are. So they are, in a way, experimenting. But by applying these new innovations, we don't see that in the passage. It's not that these societal and technological developments are being applied onto the maps. These have made map readers more demanding, and that is why cartographers are paying more attention to the usability of the maps. That is the original argument given here, usability of the maps, to see that the maps are more usable. So once again, we find that there is distortion and limitation to this option as well. Between A and D, A and Delhi, we have both options equally limited because they both omit one, direct mention of the past. Second, the aspect of societal development. They only fix upon technological developments. But that said, A is otherwise clean. It does not have any distortions. D does. So D is further inferior. We can knock it off the board. The correct answer then is A. Now, let us look at a slightly more challenging question. Not necessarily challenging because it is quite verbose. There's a lot of written material here. This passage is big, the options are big, but still there are close options. So that is why this is more challenging than the previous ones. This is taken from CAT 2024 shift 2, that is the afternoon shift. The passage talks about states warfare, the way states conduct warfare using the dying model. We'll expand upon that in a moment. But this is primarily in the sense of information warfare, warfare by targeting information. We see that different from individuals, states conduct warfare operations using the dying model: diplomacy, information, military, and economics. This is actually a progression, steps in a progression. We have first diplomacy, then information. So first diplomacy is tried. Then when that fails, information is targeted. Then the military is deployed. And then finally, economics are used to maybe stem a war, maybe turn the tide, etc. We'll get a competitive advantage. Most states do everything they can to inflict pain and confusion on their enemies before deploying the military. In fact, attacks on vectors of information are a well-worn tactic of war. It's very interesting, this usage of the phrase well-worn. It is not well-known, it is well-worn. Something which is worn is basically which has become a little smooth by usage. So it has become smooth, soft, because it has been used quite a lot. In terms of weapons, well-worn weapons are considered to be good because they have been used extensively. Newer weapons might be more rigid, more stiff. The triggers and all might be more stiff. As such, might take more effort to pull. But used weapons, well-worn weapons, they are smooth if they have been taken care of. they can get like people can get much better, soldiers can get much better use out of them. So attacks on vectors of information are well-worn tactics of war, usually and are usually the first target when the charge begins. It is common for telecom data. So then we see, after all of this is mentioned, we establish first that there is the dying model. This is how states conduct warfare operations, where they target information, attacks on vectors of information. Then we see how this is done. There are three aspects given, three ways in which information targeting or attack on vectors of information is conducted. First one, it is common for telecom data and communications network to be routinely monitored by governments, which is why open data policies of the web are so concerning to many advocates of privacy and human rights. Then we see the second one is the adoption of social media. With the worldwide adoption of social media, many governments are getting involved in low-grade information warfare through the use of cyber troops. Cyber troops are people who have been sponsored by the state to spread propaganda, to brainwash people over the internet. And this is made possible by the open nature of the internet. So adoption of social media, this is the second one. The first one is common for telecom data and communications networks to be monitored. This is one. The second one is adoption of social media. The third one then comes here. According to a study by the Oxford Internet Institute in 2020, cyber troops are government or political party actors tasked with manipulating public opinions online. The Oxford Research Group was able to identify 81 countries with active cyber troop operations utilizing many different strategies to spread false information, including spending millions on online advertising. So we find here that the use of cyber troops, that is sort of consistent with this, sort of consistent with the previous one. But the previous one is the worldwide adoption of social media. So we can cover cyber troops as a third aspect. So the three aspects of how, the three methodologies or approaches to how information attacks happen, or attacks on vectors of information are conducted by states, those are given. Let's look at the options. A says, following the DIME model, so DIME is one tally, many governments have taken advantage of open data policies. Governments is another tally. This is the two subjects, governments and states, same thing. DIME, that is also mentioned. We have more mentions of the state, but anyways, have taken advantage of the open data policies of the web. Open data policies is something that we see in the context of social media, etc., monitoring telecom data, etc., which is why the open data policies of the web. Let's say that this talks about monitoring data. To deploy cyber troops is the third aspect that we were talking about, who manipulate domestic public opinion using advertising. Using advertising is a passing reference. One could include this or may not include this. It's not necessary to do so. But we see that we have one tally here, the second tally with governments here. Open data policies to deploy cyber troops. That's the third tally here. Manipulate domestic opinion using advertising. Other strategies to spread false information. Other strategies we have sort of subsumed, but this is to spread false information, which is specifically an argument from here, which is also relevant to cyber troops. So we realize that this option actually only talks about domestic public opinion, which might be talking about adoption of social media, and talks about cyber troops. It does not talk about monitoring of telecom data and communications. So this is not a very inclusive. It has something missing from it. So it's a bit limited, but otherwise it covers a lot of ground. Let's see if we find a better choice. Otherwise, this would have to be the answer. B says, as part of conducting information warfare as per the DIME model, let's keep tallying. Information warfare, DIME model, governments routinely monitor telecom data, that's the first one, and use cyber troop, that's the third one, on social media to manipulate public opinion. Social media and public opinion, that's the second one. So we have B covering much more ground than A does. B covers all the aspects, all the premises that we had noticed in the passage, when A misses out one of them, which is the monitoring of telecom data that we have over here, which means that compared to B, A is inferior. So we can rule out A. Let us not qualify B yet. Let's see if we find an even better choice. C tells us, using the DIME model together with military operations, many governments simultaneously conduct information warfare with the help of cyber troops and routinely monitor telecom data and communication networks. We see using the nine model together with military operations, hold on to this thought, many governments simultaneously conduct information warfare with the help of cyber troops. We have one aspect here, routinely monitor telecom data and communication networks, another aspect. Now, this has two problems. The first problem is, let's clear all of this out and then see. The first problem that we see here is that it distorts the premise by saying together with military operations. The passage clearly mentions that even before military operations or the military is deployed, states use the dying model. They target vectors of information before military is deployed. It is mentioned particularly here. Most states do everything they can to inflict pain and confusion on their enemies before deploying the military. In fact, attacks on vectors of information are a well-worn tactic of war and usually are the first target when the charge begins. So we see that together with military operations is a distortion. This attack on information, this happens before the military is deployed. First. Second, this talks about cyber troops. This talks about routinely monitoring telecom and communication data. Does not talk directly about social media. Now, one could say that cyber troops is mentioned in the context of social media. That is fine. But then we had option B, which mentioned social media. So it is still better. By comparison, we find that B is still better, still the better choice. C is inferior, limited, and there is a baseless assumption. So C is not the answer. We can knock it off. D says, governments primarily use the dying model to deploy cyber troops who practice low-grade information warfare, seeking to manipulate public information with the objective of inflicting pain and confusion on their enemies. Now, again, we have distortions here. Governments primarily use the dying model, two tallies. Cyber troops, this is the third methodology, practice low-grade information warfare, seeking to manipulate public opinion. This is from the last few statements, again, mentioned in the context of cyber troops. The objective of inflicting pain and confusion, this is mentioned here on their enemies, but this is not necessarily by the use of cyber troops. Again, by that context, or on that front, we see that cyber troops are mentioned. We don't see any mention of social media. We don't see any mention of monitoring of data, telecom and communications data. So B, mentioning these, all three, monitoring telecom, communication data, social media, cyber troops, is still better than option Delhi. So by that comparison, we find that D also, Delhi, also can be eliminated. Thus we have B, which is the best choice. In general, this is the one technique or one approach that one should employ always when answering summary questions. Do not mark the correct answer till all the options are considered. Keep eliminating options. What is left after you've eliminated three choices, what is left would be your answer. That is the final thing. That is the one best one which cannot be eliminated when the others could. Or by comparison, it can be dropped. The most important technique in answering summary questions is comparison. When dealing with close options, consider them parallelly, compare, and then try to map them across to the passage. Particularly with passages such as this, that's easier said than done because there's a lot of information, a lot of data. One should also keep in mind that summaries are theta questions. So this is the +3 correct answer, -1 incorrect answer. They have the negative marking, the negative penalty, or the penalty marking rather. So if one finds a passage such as this or a question such as this, which is extremely time-taking or confusing, one may decide to drop that question. The CAT is as much about dropping questions, leaving them unanswered, as it is about answering questions. So with that understood, we should have some perspective over summary questions. Now let us try another type. Right. So now that we have finished with the other three topics for the CAT VA, let's talk about the final one, jumble sentences, odd statements. The format should be quite clear. We have 5 statements given to us. These are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the present year, it was also in some cases numbered A, B, C, D, E. We have to find one which does not belong. Now, this is not going to be that easy, where something which does not belong is a completely different subject, completely different context, completely different perspective. No. Usually, statements are very close. They belong to the same subject, the same premise, etc. It's just that the treatment is different. In this, let us understand we have to weigh statements against each other and find the one which is the most different from the others. So let's look at a few questions. This question is from CAT 2024, the first shift, the morning shift. This says, urbanites also have more and better options for getting around. Uber is ubiquitous, easy to rent, dockless bicycles are spreading, battery-powered scooters will be next. So this seems like it is talking about modes of transportation, public transportation available to people in urban areas, urban settings. 2 says, when more people use buses or trains, the service usually improves because public transport agencies run more buses and trains. So again, we seem to be on the right track. It seems to be talking about these statements seem to be talking about public transport, modes of public transportation available to urban populations. 3 says, worsening services on public transport, terrorist attacks in some areas, some urban metros, and a rise in fares have been blamed for this trend. Now, this talks about this trend, but we're talking about public transport, yes. We're also talking about a trend towards not use of public transport, worsening services, terrorist attacks, rise in fares, etc. As of right now, this seems to be the odd statement. We have not finalized yet. Let us decide. But this seems to be the one which is the most different. 4 says, it seems more likely that public transport is being squeezed structurally as people's need to travel is diminishing as a result of smartphones, video conferencing, online shopping, and so on. Now, this makes it quite clear that 3 actually belongs to the sequence. We were wrong in marking 3 as the odd statement. We see that these 2 statements, 3 and 4, they're both talking about a reduction in the use of public transport. The reasons behind that are given. It seems more likely that public transport is being squeezed structurally as people's need to travel is diminishing as a result of smartphones, video conferencing, online shopping, and so on. Worsening services on public transport, terrorist attacks in some urban metros, and a rise in fares have been blamed for this trend. So it seems as if, because then we are talking about public transport agencies running more buses and trains, now it becomes somewhat clear that 2 might be the odd statement. 1 is slightly different on that context because it is not talking directly about public transport, it's actually talking about Uber, etc. So we'll see about which one exactly is the odd statement, but should be between 1 and 2. When we look at 5, the rest of the sequence becomes clear. There has been a puzzling decline in the use of urban public transport in many countries in the West, despite the growth in urban populations and rising employments. So despite growth in urban populations, we see that the context is, the situation is urban settings, rising employment. Despite that, there has been a puzzling decline in the use of urban public transport in many countries in the West. We see that this mentions a trend in a decline in the use of urban public transport. And then we've seen that another statement, it talks about this trend, which is statement 3. So statement 3 and 5 are directly connected. Let's remember, we don't have to sequence the statements in an odd statement type question. Sometimes the sequence just appears, sometimes we can get connections, but we don't have to waste time on it. It should not take any effort on our part. So 5 and 3 are interconnected, we can rule them out. 4 is on a similar aspect, or it's talking about the same issue. It seems more likely that public transport is being squeezed. So another reason why there is a trend towards lower use of public transport, clearly 4 is also not the answer. 4 is connected, we can rule it out. Between 1 and 2, 2 goes directly opposite to this. When people use buses and trains, the service usually improves because public transport agencies run more buses and trains. One, we are talking about increasing the number of buses, trains that are being run, first off. Second, we're talking about people using buses and trains, which there is a trend against in the other statements. Third, services usually improve is almost directly contradictory to this statement. So it seems as if 2 is the incorrect answer, or 2 is the correct answer. It's the odd statement. Let's look at 1 to confirm. Urbanites also have more and better options for getting around. So we see that public transport, again, this suggests that public transport is taking a hit because there are changes in the society. There are other options. 1 statement of options is given by 4, why public transport is being squeezed structurally. Why is there a decline in the use of public transport? Because people's need to travel is diminishing as a result of smartphones, video conferencing, and online shopping, and so on. Other reasons are worsening service, terrorist attacks in some urban metros, rise in fares have been blamed for this trend. Also, urban people, have more and better options for getting around. Uber is ubiquitous, easy to rent dockless bicycles are spreading, battery-powered scooters will be next. So we realize that all of this again goes to prove that there is a trend towards declining use of public transport in urban settings. It is 2, which talks about an increase in the use of public transport, increase in the use of buses, trains, modes of public transport, improvement in services, which is clearly against the idea given in the other statements. So the odd statement is 2. Now let us look at a slightly more challenging question. This question is from the third shift of 2024, CAT 2024. It says here, part of the appeal of forecasting is not just that it seems to work, but that you don't seem to need specialized expertise to succeed at it. The subject is forecasting. It talks about an appeal of forecasting, and that is that it seems to work, that you don't need specialized expertise to succeed at it. B says the tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world helps explain why so much of the early interest in the idea came from the intelligence community. At first, this doesn't seem connected, but the very next statement talks about intelligence. This was true even though the latter had access to classified intelligence. Also, this was true, had access, this is in the past tense, and we talk about early interest in the idea came from. So again, in the past tense. So B and C might be connected. Let's look at D and E as well. One frequently cited study found that accurate forecasters' prediction of geopolitical events, when aggregated using standard scientific methods, were more accurate than the forecasts of members of the US intelligence community who answered the same questions in a confidential prediction market. This shows us that A might also be connected, because this says that when this cited study is considered, this stated that when aggregated methods using standard scientific methods, prediction was made using standard scientific methods, the predictions were more accurate as compared to the forecast made by members of the US intelligence community who answered the same questions in a confidential prediction market. Though the intelligence community probably had more intelligence, that seems to connect it with this as well, they still did not make as accurate forecasts as standard average people did using standard scientific methods. We see this correlates with the idea that you don't seem to need specialized expertise to succeed at forecasting. So that means that A and D are connected. We can rule them out. It also suggests that C is connected. Let's confirm on that. E says the aggregated opinion of non-experts during forecasts have proven to be a better guide to the future than the aggregated opinion of experts. Again, drumming the same idea, experts not being as good at forecasts as non-experts being. So this is also directly connected with the idea given in A and D. Also, we see here that experts, etc., is referring to potentially the US intelligence community, or there's an example of the US intelligence community here that then correlates with C. This was true even though the latter had access to classified intelligence. The latter now suggests, because it's talking about the second of 2 choices. The former, the latter. The latter is talking about experts in the case of statement E. We see here non-experts doing forecasts have been proven to be a better guide to the future than the aggregated opinion of experts. Non-experts, experts. The latter, this was true that non-experts, they make better predictions as compared to experts. This was true even though the latter, the experts, had access to classified intelligence. Then we see there is statement D, one frequently cited study found that accurate forecasters' prediction of geopolitical events, when aggregated using standard scientific methods, were more accurate than the forecasts of members of the US intelligence community, those who had access to classified intelligence, who answered the same questions in a confidential prediction market. So all of these then form a connected set, which means that C is also connected. We can rule it out. Now, Once we have this understood, we look at B and we realize B is actually talking about something else. The tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world helps explain why so much of the early interest in the idea came from the intelligence community. One, this is talking about forecasting and building a model, the connection between that. Second, it is talking about the early interest in the idea of forecasting, which does not correlate with the rest of the statements, because the rest of the statements, they are drawing this comparison between experts and non-experts and saying that non-experts, even those who did not have access to classified intelligence, they made better and more accurate predictions. This is talking about something else entirely. And also, this is limited to the intelligence community. This does not connect to the fact that the intelligence community, despite having classified information, classified intelligence, did not make as good predictions or as accurate predictions as non-experts did. So we find out now that B is actually the one that is most different from the other statements. That is the correct answer. Once this is done, let us look at another question which is even harder, more challenging. Now, this is a really difficult question. This is from CAT 2024, first shift, morning shift. It says here, animals have an interest in fulfilling their basic needs, but also in avoiding suffering, and thus we ought to extend moral considerations. Singer viewed himself as a utilitarian and presents a direct moral theory concerning animal rights, in contrast to indirect positions such as welfarist views. Now we see that there is some common between statements 1 and 2. We're talking about concerning animal rights or a moral theory concerning animal rights, and we are talking about extending moral consideration to animals. So that ways these two may be connected. But here we are not only talking about Singer, but we are also talking about his identity as utilitarian, different from, in contrast to positions such as the welfarist views. So we might actually have two as the odd statement. Let's look at the other ones. He argued, he must be talking about Singer, unless we have another subject mentioned in the remaining sentences. He argued for extending moral considerations to animals because, similar to humans, animals have certain significant interests. Now, this seems to also be connected with extending moral considerations and also animals having interests. So one actually seems connected. 4 says the event that publicly announced animal rights as a legitimate issue within contemporary philosophy was Peter Singer's animal liberation text in 1975. This connects with 2. Singer viewed himself as utilitarian, presents a direct moral theory concerning animal rights in contrast to indirect positions such as welfarist views. So 5 must be the odd statement. As such, we ought to view their interests alongside and equal to human interests, which results in humans having direct moral duties towards animals. After reading this, we would at first be at a loss because everything seems to be connected. This is a truly tough question where it is quite difficult to realize what the difference is because the difference is so fine, so minute. That makes this question even hard. Because if we look at the statements as options, then the statements are very close. That means the options are very close. But we realize eventually that it is statement 1 which is different. First off, we have statement 4. We are not sequencing these statements, but sequence sort of appears because this introduces Peter Singer and also the liberation text. So this clearly would come first in the sequence. The event that publicly announced animal rights as a legitimate issue within contemporary philosophy was Peter Singer's animal liberation text. First off, this introduces Peter Singer, the liberation text. This also talks about animal rights, but it doesn't talk about moral consideration. Doesn't also make the connection with human interests, the correlation between or the comparison between human interests and animal interests. It doesn't do that, which means that 4 is the opening statement in this sequence. We are not sequencing it, but just so we know. Then we have Singer being talked about in 2. Singer viewed himself as a utilitarian and presents a direct moral theory concerning animal rights. Here, moral theory comes into play. Animals we were talking about, animal rights we were talking about in statement 4 as well, in contrast to indirect positions such as welfarist views. Here, Singer's view is further expanded upon. So this then directly connects, almost certainly directly connects with statement 5. So we can rule out statement 2 as well. He is talking about Singer. He argued for extending moral consideration to animals. Here we introduce the idea of moral consideration to animals because similar to humans, animals have certain significant interests. We are talking about animals as interests, moral considerations being extended to animals. Then comes the aspect of the comparison between humans and animals. Similar to humans, animals have certain significant interests. This correlates with 5. As such, we ought to view their interest. Here is referring to animals, and alongside and equal to human interests, which results in humans having direct moral duties towards humans. So towards animals. So we realize that these two statements again are connected. So 3 and 5 can be ruled out. What remains is 1. 1 talks about animals. They have an interest in fulfilling their basic needs, but also in avoiding suffering, and thus we ought to extend moral consideration. Now, as I've already said, as I've already stated, this is very close. This seems very connected. But what is different here is that in the other statements, either we had the general statements such as 2 and 4, which only talked about Singer, which only talked about his moral theory concerning animal rights, or else we talked about extending moral consideration to animals because of their interests, and then compared these interests with humans. So human interests alongside and equal to human. So we have these two statements also connected by that thread. Here, interests are mentioned, but we are talking about interests versus interests among animals. It is not a comparison between human interests and animal interests and them being similar. It is animal interests versus animal interests, and then there's a hint of something different between the two, because we see this change of argument word, but also. Animals have an interest in fulfilling their needs, their basic needs, but also in avoiding suffering, and thus we ought to extend moral consideration. So here also we're talking about moral consideration, but the idea, the confirmation of why moral consideration must be extended to animals comes from the difference between the contrast between, one could say, their interest in fulfilling their basic needs, but also in avoiding suffering. So it is because of avoiding suffering, not because of fulfilling their basic needs, which seems to suggest that there is some distortion between this and the other statements. We were only talking about comparison or equality between human interests and animal interests in the other statements. We don't see two interests contradictory to each other or at odds with each other. It is not because of this, but rather because of this that we should extend moral considerations. So we find that it is statement A that is the most different. Now, with that done, we have finished with the discussion. Our PYQs discussion is over. We have covered all the 4 topics. So let's come to our outro section. Let's come to a conclusion of the session. Here we go. So this brings our session, the discussion on the previous year's questions from the CAT, to a close. We have discussed both RC and VA, all the topics of VA. Let us see what this year's CAT 25, and the upcoming years of CAT bring to the table in terms of the CAT exam. Let's see what changes happen. In the meantime, I hope you found this as entertaining as you found it enlightening. If you did find it interesting, please do spread the word, share it with your friends, share it with anyone who can find help, who can find guidance from this video. Also, thank you very much for joining us, and we will keep on coming up with sessions like this. The entire GD VAT PI season is about to commence. There'll be sessions on these topics: GD, VAT, PI, also grooming, personality development, profiling, etc. The Achievers batch and the Directors batch, they're both about to commence in a few weeks. Please contact Erudite to find out more. Also, do subscribe and like this video, share this video. Do click the bell so that you are informed when these videos drop, and I will see you in further videos with more information. All right, bye-bye. Have a good day.